Are we starting?
Kind of arranged here. Straighten my hair.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Good. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good. How are you?
Hey, Andy, how you doing?
Hanging in there.
I'm pretty much the same nowadays.
Can I take another bite of my breakfast?
Welcome to Conversations with Writers, a retrospective. I'm Andy, I'm a writer, and to celebrate the anniversary of the series, in this video, I want to read some of my favorite pieces by the writers I've interviewed over the last 12 months, and talk about some of the things I love about these pieces. The pieces that I'm referencing will be linked in the description box below. This is called Snap by Alison Jaenicke, and it was published in Isthmus. In Curie Beach, North Carolina, we practiced our selfies in front of the pier. Its pylons like the spindly legs of great blue herons splayed in a long lineup out into the foamy surf behind us. We snapped a bunch of selfies, the best of which we would later share with friends online. Then we wandered south along hard, wet sand in running shoes, collected shell shards, the ocean here too harsh to offer them up whole, and came back hungry to the town center and its tiny boardwalk bandshell cluster of small, low shops. Curie Beach Diner, best known for its hush puppies, offered us slick red seats next to windows framing ocean, boardwalk, and the pier. Born before all of us in the room. Built in 1923, it was the first fishing pier on the Atlantic Ocean. The Diner's red and black color scheme, its Coca-Cola artwork, nodded to its 1950s birth. My husband ate his oyster po' boy, and me, my fried flounder, in the cheerful and cozy room, our gaze gravitating to the ocean. When guys rushed past with fire and rescue gear, surfboard, bodyboard, stretcher, our languid waitress came to life, filling our water from a pitcher with her left hand, right hand pointing. Look at Mark. It must be something serious to pull him from work in the middle of the day. Send him into the cold water. Bare upper body puff, dress pants, dark and clingy wet, short hair glistening with seawater. A young man strode past the window. Waitresses drifted outside, came back to report that Mark would speak to no one. Rushed past without a word. We poked at our fried food. Then news trickled in. A man had jumped from the pier. Was alive but unconscious. One waitress shook her head, said, "It's a long drop, with old posts hiding beneath the surface, waiting to come up and smack a jumper." We paid up, slipped out, toted our beach chairs past EMTs who wheeled a man on a stretcher into the back of an ambulance. I did not see him move, could not see his eyes or face. On the beach I tried to read, but my mind was with the guy rushed away beneath flashing red lights. Why did he do it? For fun? Suicide? A dare? A thick blanket of cloud suffocated the sun, and I shuffled my feet deeper into the cool sand, rubbing my legs to chase away the chill. Finally, I crossed back over the boardwalk to the car to retrieve my down coat, green as the algae hugging the pier's legs. Huddled against the wind, I tried again to read, but the appearance of a boat distracted me. An orange curved hull beneath a small white cabin. The Coast Guard vessel churned back and forth beyond the waves' lacy fringe, south of the pier, then back north, bobbing on the slight ocean swells. "They're looking for a body," I whispered, a second jumper. We did not stay to see the end of the story. Even with the boat still stowing the water nervously, we picked up and left, drove south about 9 miles to the peninsula tip to explore Fort Fisher, with its lonely and gnarled cedars, green hair blown leeward. Then we drove north again, past Curie, where helicopters now circled to Wilmington, where we sat at the dark mirrored bar in Front Street Brewery, and I sipped a pint of beer while searching my phone fruitlessly for Curie Beach Rescue. The next morning at our campsite, while sunlight clothed our picnic table, I moved on to sipping coffee and Googled again. Wilmington News reported the rescue, the fact of a second jumper, that the Coast Guard searched for an individual until 5 p.m., then gave up. How can I fault myself for taking the crispy flounder onto my tongue, for drinking a pale ale while salt water flooded his mouth and nose, for not sensing his body, the young father's body, the paper said, wash ashore at Fort Fisher nearly a week later, for untethering my mind and connecting it elsewhere up north for nearly 3 months. How can I fault myself for not going back sooner to discover his fate? But I do. Drawn by late winter sun, in early March my husband and I had driven car and teardrop campers toward the Carolina coast. Curie Beach was a stop along the way, after which we made our way down to Charleston, then inland and back home. Back to the tail end of winter, to responsibilities and distractions and other stories. At the end of May, with time to search again, I find the culminating story online, a photo of 2 dark-haired friends smiling and forming cryptic hand gestures I cannot parse. I berate myself for not knowing sooner, as if knowing would affect anything. A late March Star News headline proclaims, fatal jump from Curie Beach Pier captured on Snapchat video. Maynard Francisco Cruz Valdez, 25, disappeared in the water at 1:40 p.m. March 6, after jumping from the pier that juts 712 feet into the ocean. Dennis Meza, 26, Valdez's childhood friend, captured the jump as Valdez hit the water. Of course, I watched the video. Likely you will Google it now, too, dear reader. Here's how it goes. Tinny music trades with laughter, Spanish words, a panorama of the surf and beach from the pier, us viewers spinning dizzily with the camera. In the early part of the video, an overlaid emoticon, yellow smiley face and black sunglasses, declares fun in the sun. Then the lens turns its focus on the water below, the ocean mirrored and massive and muscular. A splash, then a foamy collar radiates out from the minuscule man. A blackbird slices across the blue-framed sky, wings pointing out like witches' hats. Then the tiny splotches struggle toward shore. It'll take him in eventually, Meza says to someone standing near him, or perhaps to himself. In the news article, Meza recounts, after 2 or 3 minutes later, he said, I'm tired. When I heard that, I tried to find something to throw, but again I heard, brother, I'm tired, I can't make it. This is the moment Valdez knows. This is the moment his friend sets down the phone and jumps in after him. The recording has been going for 40 seconds. Both from Honduras, neither man considered how cold the water would be, considering that 60 degrees could mean hypothermia, coma, death. Meza dove, grabbed Valdez twice, but a wave separated the two. When he went for his friend a third time, he saw him slip beneath the surface. Meza's legs stopped working. Then he could not feel them. At that second, he heard a voice say, come to me. And Meza reached for the arms that would keep him alive, would pull him away from his friend, invisible beneath the waves now. Who can blame him? I imagine our hero Mark driving fast into the parking lot by the diner, dashing across the sand, laying himself out on the red rescue board to stroke toward the flailing man, the only one he knows he must save. Perhaps Meza screamed, my friend, my brother, as Mark pulled him toward shore. Perhaps the person who phoned for help was there waiting on the beach in the clump of onlookers, pointing back out, saying, there were 2. I imagine the crowd, small on an early March weekday, moving down the beach, scanning the water, seeing nothing arise. The young people had strung up hammocks beneath the pier, left them slack, didn't occupy them again that afternoon, returned after the drama to take them down and head inland. Later, Meza reflects. He never thinks he would come out dead. In his mind, he was young, he could swim, and he would come out walking. For the rest of his life, Meza would be bound with Valdez, seared by the ease with which his friend slipped away. Mark will always carry the story, wondering if there might have been a way to find and save them both. For years to come, the waitresses will tell the tale to visitors gazing out the diner's window toward the pier. And there will always be the footage of this young man's last moments, tucked neatly into the rectangular frame of the video, floating freely to anyone worldwide who might seek to stumble upon it. It can be viewed through the rectangle of a phone or a tablet or a computer as many times as there are impulses to view it. It will live on even while he does not. This eternal life comes from a platform designed to offer disappearing pictures, a platform represented by the ghost-shaped icon Ghost-Faced Killa, a platform that bills itself as focusing on the ephemeral nature of fleeting encounters. With its mobile-only photos and videos, Snapchat was purposely designed to make images on the move, images that would self-destruct after being viewed by the recipient. The fleetingness of snaps would address the stress caused by the permanence of personal information posted online. It would be a way to counteract the trend of users feeling compelled to manage an idealized identity of themselves that would live online forever. Snapchat's motto: life's more fun when you live in the moment. Both Snapchat and Instagram were meant to be more raw and spontaneous than Facebook and other curated websites. And yet, as Snapchat has evolved, it has come closer to what it aimed to avoid. It offers Snapchat stories and memories, words that by definition dwell in the past. They last longer and are shared more widely than snaps, are curated and filtered, anything but transient and raw. This is the way we live today. I post the smiling selfie of my husband and me in front of the Curie Beach Pier and a Facebook album along with sun-soaked buildings in Wilmington and flower-frocked historic homes in Charleston, sunsets with silhouetted sailboats and dinner plates with seafood, all neatly framed. I do not post my photo of the Coast Guard boat. I have no photo of the ambulance or Mark brushing past the diner window. Our friends will only know what I show. I wonder whether Maynard Valdez's death was a product of his desire for the snap. If the possibility of recording and publishing hadn't existed, would he still have jumped? A GoFundMe campaign was set up to send Valdez's body back to Honduras. It is now closed. His body returned to his homeland. When I find the news article in May, the comment section has 0 comments. I cannot stomach that 0. I make myself part of his story, writing, I sat on the beach that day and watched the Coast Guard boat go back and forth, searching. What a heartbreaking outcome. Thinking of this young man and his family tonight. And this is as much as I can do, as far as I can follow. This is where my trail of knowing stops. The World Wide Web ensnares me yet weaves a paltry narrative, leaves me to pull for other threads that I'll never find the end of. What child or children made the young Valdez a father, who bid farewell to his body in North Carolina and welcomed it in Honduras? Do tropical glossy plants surround his grave, flowering in season? I want the army of great blue heron entrapped in the pier to rise up, crack the screen of our selfies, fly free, and follow the undiluted line Valdez's body took as it made its way down the coast, floating then alighting at Fort Fisher. I want the roots of the plants covering Valdez's grave in Honduras to crack open that box and set him and his story free. What I really like about this particular story is its use of framing and braiding. We're moving through a lot of different locations here, and we have to figure out a way to navigate that through restrictive page space. And one way that Jaenicke does that is through this idea of framing. So we start with the blue herons and then we end with those. And that makes the story feel as if it's come full circle, even though there's a lot going on, even though there's a lot of transitions, even though there's more that could be told, and more connections that we could make. Using that framing technique makes it feel as if it's come full circle, and the reader gets a satisfying end. Another really interesting thing that I find about this is, again, the braiding. So using pieces of news stories and photos and those descriptions to help us transition from one scene to the next is really helpful to refocus and also remind us where we came from and thread these different stories or these different locations together. One last thing that I find interesting about this piece, or that I really love about this piece, is the way that Jaenicke uses something tactile like social media in order to make a comment about the larger aspect of the human condition or the human experience. And in this case, we're looking at a sense of permanence and non-permanence, and she's juxtaposing that with the nature of human life. So I think that's a really interesting way in order to create something that's a little bit more digestible in order to come to some understanding about mortality. What did you find interesting about this particular piece or another piece by this particular author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called 10 Things You Might Like to Know About Madwoman by Shara McCallum, and it's from her collection, Madwoman. 1. The source of her rage and joy are the same, which is true of many people, where she's from, who, at one point or another, have not had a pot to piss in. 2. Like everyone, she has her flaws. For instance, she's convinced of the importance of her own grief. 3. In her own mind, she sometimes moonlights as the earth. As a girl, she once built a raft from blue maho, masking tape, and her own foolishness. 3b. This may or may not be true, but sharks wouldn't go near it anyway. 4. For instance, she really loves ABBA and thinks Chiquita was written for her personally. If you know the song, or might care to Google it, and listen on YouTube, even if you don't understand why she persists in this delusion, she hopes, despite your better judgment, taste in music, and or profound sense of ironic detachment, that you'll love it. 5. While she has little actual faith, having lost most of it somewhere in a gully, perhaps in the big rainstorm that took place sometime in her childhood, which is her usual guess for everything, and therefore cannot in good conscience recommend to you the act of praying, she has nonetheless cultivated a deep belief in the color red, as in the poppy, which she admires since it seems harnessed to nothing but its own fiery display. 7.5. She has already grown tired of this list and is irritated, with herself, not you, that she is now obligated to 4 or 5 more disclosures depending on how you're counting. 6. She is concerned details of her past make people uncomfortable. For example, her father was crazy. Not just in the colloquial sense. For example, he killed himself. 5b. It might be better to be a gardenia, less showy. This is what she thinks on the days she's not admiring the poppy. 6b. Since she's told you the story of her father, she wants to assure you she's fine now, which you might conclude anyway if you met her, because she smiles a lot. 7. She has problems distinguishing fact from fiction. 8. Also, she's concerned lists are way too postmodern, a theory which at first she thinks is shiny as a new penny, then quickly finds annoying and infectious like sandflies. She wants to assure you this is true even if she's mixed race, from a host of nations, the sum of a bunch of world religions, and born in 1972. 8b. Now that she's alluded to literature and theory, she's a bit alarmed you might begin to think of her as a character in a story. On the other hand, she likes stories very much, especially those rarer ones in which women get to be the heroes. So if you can't help yourself, then she thinks it would be okay, but asks that you please make her a mint. 5c. Or would it be better to be a cricket, she wonders. She's primarily thinking of the chirping kind when she asks herself this, but if your brain hears cricket and jumps to the sport, then items number 1, 3, 4, and 5 will likely carry different meaning for you. 9. She's pleased the numerical value of the Hebrew word chai, meaning life, is 18 because she happens to have been born on October 18th. She's always liked coincidences like this one, or that her name means poetry and song, Hebrew again, or that she emigrated from Jamaica to the US on the day of Bob Marley's funeral. She thinks 18 must therefore be an omen, which is useful because even if she doesn't believe in signs, this gives her an exit strategy. And she's always heard it's a good idea to quit while you're ahead, presuming you're ahead. 10. Okay, now she's concerned that last item was too hopeful, too perfect, or was trying too hard. All of the above, or none of them, she can't quite put her finger on it. 10b. But more importantly, she's worried that if you've been paying attention, you've likely figured out she's confused about many things. For example, math, God, the hegemony of ice cream over all other desserts, memory, parental love, her defense of wearing dresses in winter, all endings but notably those of poems and people, winter itself, all other types of love, the universe, origins, eternity, and so on. One thing I really appreciate about this particular poem is the author's use of disruption. So the poem is in list format, but the author disrupts the sequence to further communicate our character Madwoman through craft, something about Madwoman through craft. So we pull that numbered list out of its natural sequence. We're reflecting back and forwards. We're skipping and jumping around. And that, I believe, is supposed to help communicate that sense of madness. But when we're looking at the individual components of the list, they do seem quite sane and quite reflective. And Madwoman seems quite good at compartmentalizing in order to push through trauma, which doesn't seem mad at all. It seems like a quite healthy way to deal with things. But this might also suggest something about the perception of women. So I think this is a really clever way to communicate these disruptions or these fractures in identity and role and perception through craft. And I think creating a distanced journalistic tone helps reinforce that, where we're also seeing Madwoman doing some pretty deep introspection to learn more about the self. What's something that struck you about this piece or another work by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Petrifyin, Canonical Counter-Discourse in 2 Caribbean Women's Medusa Poems by Phillip Zapkin, and it was published in Humanities. I'm going to be reading the abstract, the introduction, an excerpt from the body, and the conclusion to give you a sense of the argument. This essay utilizes Helen Tiffin's idea of canonical counter-discourse to read the Medusa poems of Shara McCallum and Dorothea Smart, 2 female Caribbean poets. Essentially, canonical counter-discourse involves authors rewriting works or giving voice to peripheral, silenced characters from the literary canon to challenge inequalities upheld by power structures such as imperialism and patriarchy. McCallum's and Smart's poems represent Medusa to reflect their own concerns as women of color from Jamaica and Barbados, respectively. McCallum's Madwoman as Rasa Medusa aligns the titular characters from her book Madwoman with Medusa to express Madwoman's righteous anger at the wanton and gravelicious ways of Babylon addressed in second person. Smart's series of Medusa poems from Connecting Medium explore the pain of hair and skin treatments Black women endure to try to meet Eurocentric beauty standards, as well as the struggles of immigrants, particularly people of color. Both poets claim Medusa as kindred, empowering Medusa as a figure with agency, which she is denied in the Greco-Roman sources, and simultaneously legitimizing both Caribbean literature and the poet's feminist and post-colonial protest by linking them to the cultural capital of the classics. Introduction. What does it mean for African diasporic writers to reclaim Medusa? What does it mean for feminist writers to reclaim Medusa? In addition, perhaps more provocatively, does the verb reclaim problematically locate ownership of Medusa in literary or mythic space controlled by authors who are white and male? Emily Greenwood writes, a dominant theme in the existing literature is the apparent incongruity of classics in the context of the Caribbean, where the discipline would seem to be on the wrong side of racial, imperial, and political oppositions that have divided the region historically. However, classics were taught in the West Indian education system along with British literature as part of a systemic imposition of British/European culture, meant to override the multicultural blendings of various West African, Spanish, French, Dutch, and indigenous traditions alongside British influence. In part due to the schools and many Anglophone Caribbean nations retaining variations of British curricula, the Greco-Roman classics have remained popular amongst Caribbean authors into the post-colonial period. However, this popularity is also due to the author's rewriting of classical material to challenge the hierarchical and imperialistic assumptions of the colonial period. As Helen Tiffin argues, contemporary art, philosophy, and literature produced by post-colonial societies are not simply continuations or adaptations of European model. The processes of artistic and literary decolonization have involved a radical dismantling of European codes and post-colonial subversion. and appropriation to the dominant European discourses. Tiffin theorizes what she calls canonical counterculture, which is a specific way post-colonial authors write back to the colonial center by adapting materials from the Europeans/imperial canon and turning them into post-colonial properties. This essay utilizes the idea of canonical counter-discourse to read the Medusa poems of Shara McCallum and Dorothea Smart, poets from Jamaica and Barbados, respectively. Specifically, I am reading McCallum's Madwoman as Rasta Medusa and a series of Smart's poems from the book Connecting Medium, arguing that these poems utilize the Medusa myth to challenge both imperialist and gendered structures of domination. The speakers in McCallum's and Smart's poems identify with the Medusa myth and its cultural capital in order to challenge patriarchal and racial/colonial hierarchies. In doing so, the poems utilize canonical counter-discourse to promote a liberatory intersectional message. This essay moves dialectically, beginning with a brief biography of Medusa that draws out some of the implications not only of her story, but of the nature/process of myth itself. I then turn to how each author treats Medusa, looking closely at the poems themselves. This is followed by sections on how these poems utilize canonical counter-discourse in the feminist tradition to challenge patriarchal dominance and societal expectations of Black women, and then how these poems resist colonial/racial hierarchies that have traditionally repressed and delegitimized Afro-Caribbean people. Finally, I conclude with a section on the stakes for intersectionality in canonical counter-discourse and liberatory art. Medusa poems as feminist canonical counter-discourse. There is a prominent tradition of 20th and 21st century feminist poets reclaiming the Medusa figure/story as symbols of empowerment, thereby writing back to patriarchy by repurposing a traditionally patriarchal narrative. Alicia O. Stryker referred to this process as revisionist mythmaking, essentially an approach to adaptation theory that balances awareness of the canonical authority of mythical texts with the transformative possibilities offered by rewriting. Stryker claims revisionist mythmaking occurs when the figure or tale will be appropriated for altered ends, the old vessel filled with new wine, initially satisfying the thirst of the individual poet, but ultimately making cultural change possible. Her 1982 essay, The Thieves of Language, examines this process in American feminist poetry, showing how writers repurpose culturally authorized myths to explore liberatory politics. One influential thinker who helped conceptualize the reclamation of Medusa was Helen Sissou, whose famous 1975 essay, The Laugh of Medusa, advocated that female writers abandon phallic-centric writing practices to find ways of writing rooted in women's experience. Sissou writes, "She, woman, must write herself because this is the invention of a new insurgent writing, which, when the moment of her liberation has come, will allow her to carry out the indispensable ruptures and transformations in her history." For Sissou, Medusa became a symbol of women's silenced voices under patriarchy and masculine forms of writing. By transcending men's writing to discover new feminine/feminist forms of writing that liberate women's authentic voices, Sissou argues that women can join the laughing Medusa, a figure of freedom and joy. Many female poets and writers directly took up the challenge, picking Medusa as a symbol of this liberatory reimagination. The tendency for feminist writers, especially during the 1970s and early 1980s, was to completely reimagine Medusa as the subject in her own right, one that often reflects the anger animating so much of second-wave feminist struggles against gender inequality. As Susan Bowers writes, contemporary women writers are turning to this matriarchal image for inspiration and empowerment. These artists demonstrate how the same image that has been used to oppress women can also help set women free. Here, I give just a few prominent examples from this tradition. Mary Sarton's 1971 poem, The Muse as Medusa, closes with the quatrain, "I turn your face around, it is my face, that frozen rage is what I must explore. Oh, secret, self-enclosed, and ravaged place. This is the gift I thank Medusa for." Earlier, I quoted from Stanford's Medusa, which sits firmly in the tradition of identifying Medusa with contemporary feminist rage. Toward the end of the poem, the speaker reflects on how she would like to move beyond the fury that I do not choose, but is unable to find peace because of memories, perhaps PTSD-inspired flashbacks, of the rape by Poseidon. As a final example, Emily Irwin Culpepper explicitly links the Medusa story with feminist resistance to patriarchal violence and oppression, making it a central theme in her 1986 essay with poetry, Ancient Gorgons, A Phase for Contemporary Women's Rage. Culpepper recounts an attempt by a stranger to break into her apartment and her feelings of power after fighting him off. which she aligns with the feminist Medusa. She puts this experience into context. The Amazon Gorgon face is female fury personified. This Gorgon/Medusa image has been rapidly adopted by large numbers of feminists who recognize her as one face of our own rage. For Sarton, Sanford, and Culpeper, identification with Medusa becomes a liberatory gesture reflecting empowerment and the ability to turn a petrifying gaze upon patriarchy. The impulse to reclaim a mythic figure such as Medusa is not necessarily an obvious one. As Vanda Zajako and Miriam Leonard put it, many feminists have chosen to revivify ancient narratives to arm contemporary struggles. There is a tendency to overlook the strangeness of this choice. The myths, after all, are not the only products of an androcentric society. They can also be seen to justify its most basic patriarchal assumption. In other words, it is a striking irony that feminists use for liberatory ends to a mythology steeped in anti-feminist ideology. However, this is part of the larger trend of canonical counter-discourse that Jeremy Rosen calls minor character elaboration, which he defines as constructing narratives around the perspectives of socially marginal figures in canonical works, often seeking to critique the ideologies underlying the manner in which these works represent minor characters, or their failure to represent socially marginal figures at all. In this genre, exemplifying works such as Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, Tom Stopper's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, or J.M. Coetzee's Foe, for instance. Authors identify characters who are silenced, sidelined, or otherwise peripheral because of their gender, ethnicity, race, social class, etc., and reimagine their stories, often writing from the perspective of those minor characters. This is essentially the project Goodman describes in the introduction to Mythic Women, Real Women, which collects several performance pieces about women's experiences, including mythological women. He says, in the 1970s, the focus was often on reading against the grain, by looking for ways of re-examining male-created fictions, so that the female figures trapped in these stories might come into sharper focus. This notion of freeing the voices or perspectives of trapped minor characters, with the accompanying notion that this helps liberate historically oppressed groups, is central to many feminist attempts to recover the Medusa story. However, as Rosen points out, there are substantial limits to the actual efficacy of minor character elaboration. In lauding such texts as subversive or liberatory, critics transfigure their more modest political work of countering a previous representation with one that is more sultry. Lost is attention to representation, to the fact that the depiction of a voice has been constructed by a contemporary author manifestly is possession of the cultural capital of the traditional canon who is writing on behalf of the formerly minor character. In other words, feminist poets or writers who assume the persona of Medusa do not actually give the mythic Gorgon a voice. Medusa is not empowered to speak. There is only the illusion of that empowerment created by a modern author imagining her perspective. McCallum and Smart's Medusa poems avoid the trap Rosen identifies with minor character elaboration by writing Medusa to help understand the speakers of their poems, rather than by identifying their speakers as Medusa. On perhaps the simplest level, this is evident by Smart's continual third-person reference to Medusa, making clear that Medusa is never a speaker of the poem. This is in stark contrast to the poems such as Stanford's, where Medusa is presented in first person, with a speaker embodying Medusa as the I. In the larger sense, though, Smart references Medusa to explore contemporary issues of racial representation, colonialism, and the exploitation of women. When Smart addresses the painful self-erasure required for Black women to conform to white-created beauty standards in Medusa, Medusa Black, this is clearly a contemporary concern. Smart does not speak here on behalf of Medusa, does not attempt to give the mythical Gorgon a voice. Instead, Smart's poet persona speaks for herself, using Medusa's reviled, snaky hair as a metaphor for the shaming of Black women's hair in Europe and the US. The line, "Banish the snake woman," follows immediately after the string of images of straightening, burning, bleaching, and frying hair, linking Medusa's cursed locks to the way the white-dominated societies conceptualize Black women's hair. Similarly, the poem, "Let Me Land," aligns Medusa with immigration from the Caribbean to Britain, a journey Smart's own parents underwent. Being the child of Afro-Caribbean immigrants in London has profoundly shaped Smart's experiences, as is reflected in her poetry. With Madwoman as Rasta Medusa, the line separating the speaker from the Gorgon is thinner, but still present. While McCallum's poem is in first person, it is from the perspective of Madwoman, a character who takes many forms and speaks with many voices throughout the poetry collection that bears her name. Because Madwoman shifts her identity throughout the collection, she may actually speak from the perspective of Medusa here. But if that is true, then it is equally true that Medusa speaks from the perspective of Madwoman. The speaker of this poem is clearly Jamaican, clearly a mystic, clearly Rasta. She uses Rasta apocalyptic rhetoric. This is, therefore, not the Medusa we know from Greek mythology. In other words, like Smart, McCallum has not attempted to speak for the Medusa silenced in Hesiod, Apollodorus, Ovid, and other early writers. Instead, McCallum's speaker blends her own identity with that of Medusa as a way of exploring shared experiences of oppression and exploitation. Conclusions. The stakes for intersectionality in canonical counter-discourse. Because modes of oppression, disenfranchising, and silencing frequently work along multiple planes, we must be aware of the multiple systems of oppression many subjects find themselves within. We cannot understand these experiences unifacily. As female poets of color from the Caribbean, McCallum and Smart face multiple axes of historical forms of oppression: gendered, racial, geographic, and as immigrants or children of immigrants. As Tiffin argues, canonical counter-discursive strategies involve a mapping of the dominant discourse, a reading and exposing of its underlying assumptions, and the dismantling of these assumptions from the cross-cultural standpoint of the imperial subjectified local. While Tiffin is specifically interested in the post-colonial, subjects existing within dominant discourse are rarely one-dimensional, rarely just the colonized/post-colonial subject. Rather, subjects are also gendered, socioeconomically classed, disabled or abled, aged, etc. Therefore, in order to effectively pursue the project of dismantling matrices of power and domination, canonical counter-discourse must be understood to be intersectional, resisting multiple axes of oppression within and between societies. McCallum and Smart model this intersectional canonical counter-discourse through the complexity of their Medusa poems. As we have seen, by utilizing Greco-Roman mythology, these writers draw on the cultural capital of classical antiquity to help authorize their own expression. And these expressions challenge both patriarchy and imperialist/racist metropolitanism. At the same time, however, the poems highlight the dynamics of power by presenting complex portraits that are or can be read as critical of Caribbean people as well. The Ya to whom Madwoman as Rasta Medusa addresses itself could be patriarchal forces within Jamaica. In other poems, Madwoman often encounters gender depression from the men in her life. Furthermore, Smart's critiques of Black women painfully attempting to conform to white-centric beauty standards expose a degree of internalized racism within Black communities when natural African hairstyles are rejected as ugly or unfashionable. In these poems, there is a clear linkage between the speakers' experience as women and their experiences as racialized/colonialized subjects. To reduce the canonical counter-discourse of these Medusa poems to merely resisting one or the other form of oppression would be to miss a fundamental dimension of these authors' liberatory projects. One of the things that I really like about this piece is that it reminds us that movements do not move independent of each other. For example, anti-racism movements and women's rights movements are all moving simultaneously, and they are not divorced from each other. They have an entangled history and they depend on each other. This essay prompts me to think more about Appalachian mythology, which is an amalgamation of Celtic and Irish and Native American folklore, and maybe think a little bit more about how I can incorporate these things a little bit more clearly into my own writing to create poems of political awareness and mitigate or navigate any potential concerns that I have in terms of creating didactic language or getting up on my soapbox. So making some of those ideas a little bit more digestible for my audiences. One of the things that strikes me about this essay in terms of craft is the way that it opens. So the attention grabber here is a series of questions, and we only get 2, so we're not overwhelmed, but it prompts us to start thinking about how we might begin to answer these questions, which primes us for the argument that the essay makes. I think that's a really effective attention grabber strategy. I also appreciate that this essay uses primarily active voice. I think this helps create a stronger, more authoritative argument on the page. What strikes you about this particular piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called An Annual Report by Chris Murphy, and it's from his collection Burning All the Time. My annual report divided by season. Northeastern Oklahoma Division. Fall. Children in the swelter of August chilled in agony at back-to-school advertisements, but on the first day they delighted in new backpacks and lied about their summers. Many felt the safety of routine combined with the dread of being publicly wrong about everything. Early reports forecast fewer days at school, concern about politics reaching the children as if politics didn't reach children. Supposedly, Mr. Bryant was sleeping on someone's couch. Some days, he barely shaved. Michaela Goingsnake said he couldn't afford gas. Hunting season passed again with no one offering to take me out. In the stand on his property by the scrub of Blue Dawn, Joe selfied the hunter at repose. Bow across his knees, 2 streaks of camouflage under eye like the ultimate warrior. He killed with reverence, ate backstrap in the warmth of his kitchen, and posted his dinner on Instagram. He had rebuffed my subtle hints. The Cherokee National Holiday Stickball game at Sequoia High's football field featured dudes flying ass over tea kettle. Charlie Mouse, who everyone called Junior, unleashed a barrage on D. He barreled to the ball, cradled it between his sticks, and then rained down punishment in high parabolas at the other side's pole. At inside linebacker, Alex Howe led the state in tackles and the Locust Grove Pirates to the A3 championship, playing through his 3rd concussion of the season. 30 years later, he won't remember where he put his keys, but he'll remember everyone flooding the field as the clock wound down. In the produce section of Reesers, Becky Jane Fletcher cornered Ann Fife and complained for 15 unbroken minutes about her sprained ankle. Winter. Michaela wore a sweater when she left the house in the post-dawn frost, left the sweater inside during lunch because she was literally melting, then forgot the sweater after practice and froze. In the produce section of Reesers, Becky Jane Fletcher followed Tyler Hodge and asked twice why they didn't get the good clementines. The Tahlequah Christmas parade beat back for one more year the forces of cynicism and pettiness, debt and fracturing. The Christmas parade looked backwards in the way Oklahomans do best, with a desire to protect innocence and revel in the community. In a document review of related annual reports, the Tahlequah Christmas parade ranked number 55 on the holiday goodwill quotient, outpowering Tucson and Indianapolis. In the cramped single wide on her parents' property, Jaenicke chose between heat and presents for her daughters. The holiday season dressed the cities in beauty. There is no locale on the planet, not desert, not cornfield, not jungle, not exurb, that wears the holidays as well as cities. Lights upon lights made of benevolence of glass. Storefronts flaunted in cranberry. I walked arm in arm with Kendra to the Nutcracker Ballet, full of whiskey and champagne. Tulsa glowed like every city of every Christmas of my entire life. An unarmed black man in Tulsa was killed by a cop. The shooting was stricken from her record. Winter for the 3rd year in a row was conspicuously brief. Spring. That fucking pollen. Our greatest season, storm season, was an unmitigated victory. 73% of northeastern Oklahomans reported lying in bed with the blinds tilted open as lightning made a contemporary apocalypse of the sky. The rain swept the culverts clean. The space from car to door never short enough. We all got soaked. The avatar of Oklahoman violence, the rage that sits in the blood, the reminder that the earth is cruel and the future uncertain. Tornadoes did little damage this year. Patron saint of the forecast, Travis Meyer, steered us well. Lyon was spared. Tulsa was spared. Stillwell was spared. Miami was spared. Tahlequah's magic held strong. Michaela did not get the chance to sit on her porch, watch the funnel ride the horizon, stick her chin up, and dare it to try. Mostly men, mostly white, took to the golf course to cleanse themselves. We all know this to be the most manicured, frivolous way to get clean. We all knew what we had to be cleansed of. We took showers afterwards and felt we'd done good work. Cornerstone Fellowship gave Jaenicke a weekly reason not to drown. Destiny Berry thought they invented hell so the Iron Spoke Free Holiness Church could put her in it. In the produce section of Reesers, Becky Jane Fletcher didn't know why she was always afraid. Looking at the avocados, she blamed immigrants. As every year, Firefly season was a splendor. One night as Kendra and I drove, they rose from the fields by her grandparents' house, an intermittent blanket of light. Across northeastern Oklahoma, people felt the joy of it, and felt it in the person they loved sitting next to them in a dark car. Seriously though, the fucking pollen. Summer. Brett spent 3 days driving posts into his backyard, returning to Lowe's again and again to get the right timber, the right joists, the right crushed angular gravel while his hands ached to cripple. After the work finished, he drank a beer he could barely hold and surveyed work done right by his own muscle and his own sweat to guard his own tomatoes. The family pulled together like every year and bought $2,000 worth of fireworks. If you were raised in a nanny state with sparkler wavers, you looked aghast at 9-year-olds led to mortar tubes by drunken uncles. You heard laughing stories about Granny Rose jumping when a tube tipped over and fired under her lawn chair. In the armor of stale lotion, bud sweat, and horseshoe dust, you stood gape-mouthed as a raining willow of silver erupted over Papa James's oak. In the produce section of Reesers, Becky Jane Fletcher raged about Pastor Todd, the state of her asthma, the sugar ants in her kitchen, her nephew on the pills, her broken window unit, Janie Reston's carrot cake, the idiot drivers on 82, and the gall-danged heat that drove her mad in a loneliness that haunted her summers since she was a child. She did so at 2 captive audiences, the first escaping just before the second was backed into the Brussels sprouts. Shopping with her mom, Michaela Goingsnake vowed to never get old. Scissor-tailed flycatchers in gray and orange tumbled in displays of bravado, protection, hunger, and love from the air to alight briefly on the ground, then burst upward again. One of the things that I really appreciate about this particular story is the way that the author uses place to develop the characters. The descriptions that we get seem fundamental at any small rural town. A lot of activity is taking place at the grocery store. There's likely only one grocery store in town. The focus on the town parades and town activities and town events. We pretty much know everybody else's business in this flyover. But there are some distinctive qualities here beyond just simply telling us outright that we're in northeastern Oklahoma up front. Some of that includes the names of the characters. So Michaela Goingsnake, we have expectations of. Goingsnake evokes Cherokee heritage because when I think Goingsnake, I think Chief Goingsnake as in Trail of Tears, as in the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation. And Goingsnake was the leader of the Cherokee Nation at the time. He was considered an established warrior and a gifted orator. So we also have expectations of Michaela Goingsnake. And we do get some indication, even though she is quite young, even though we only get snippets about her, we do see her as a keen observer, especially when she sees or witnesses Becky Jane Fletcher cornering people in the grocery store to tell them about her story, about her struggles, about her challenges. And Michaela Goingsnake vows at that moment she is never going to get old. So one of the things that this story reminds me of is to be conscious of the names that I give my characters. So what's in a name? In this case, it can communicate quite a lot, especially with Michaela Goingsnake and even Becky Jane Fletcher. We have a specific kind of cadence that is reflective of rural or southern or small communities, small insular communities. So I know that going forward in my own work, I'm going to be conscious about how I'm naming my characters. I'm going to be careful not to stereotype, and I'm going to make sure that I get the right cadence for the area. something that makes sense for the location. I also appreciate the way the author transitions through time in this particular story. So everything is broken down into seasons. We get little bits and pieces about the different characters, the different town members, the different residents in this geographic space in each season. And so we can see them grow and shift and change a little bit at a bird's eye view. It's framed as an annual report, which gives the narrative eye a bit of a sense of authority and also a sense of distance. So what we get is a quasi outsider looking in, even though that narrative eye is also participating in the events of the story. So this creates a little bit of more of a complex identity for that narrative eye, and also that narrative eye's relationship with the town and the members itself. What struck you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Amphibious by Amy M. Alvarez, and it was published in Timber, a Journal of New Writing. Les Sirens, says the Frenchwoman, sliding a faux ivory bangle engraved with a mermaid on my wrist. I run a thumb across fin and scale until I come to her face, full-lipped, round nose, hair dreadlocked. I recognize her face, balance her many names on my tongue. Mammy, Wata, Yamaja, River Mama, Ocean, the Siren. Full-breasted, black and ivory, a mermaid in metamorphosis. She is not caricature, like colonial depictions of blackness pulled down from attics and brought to this market. Red-lipped, bug-eyed, coal-black. She is a loud beauty. I consider how it is to whip between worlds, consider my own body. Skin, some say, makes me ambiguous, in a tone that tells me the word is synonym for their discomfort. I buy the bangle for a few euro. Keep it on as I swim into the cold Mediterranean, basking in the space between those continents. Breathing sea. One thing that I really appreciate about this particular poem is the way the character is developed in order to create a political statement. So we get these really dense descriptions, and there's a juxtaposition between beauty and caricature, and the narrative eye is grappling with that. This creates a sense of interesting tension in the piece to help communicate that political statement. And what's really difficult to do in activism poetry and political poetry is to avoid didactic language. And one of the ways that Alvarez mitigates that or navigates that is through these dense descriptions of character, because they all have strict associations with them. And that allows that message to come through without the didactic language to bog it down. And we see an element of transformation of the character as she enters the Mediterranean, this space that seems to exist between these hard bodies of the continents. So here we're allowed freedom, we're allowed fluidity. Ambiguous is not a bad word. It doesn't carry the negative connotations in the water, because to some degree we expect water to take the shape of whatever container it's poured into. So water gets a little bit more allowance here, which maybe echoes the title a little bit more clearly as to why it's so important. This amphibious nature, this ability to mold and shift and change, to navigate complex spaces in a political reality and through a political identity. Another thing this poem does that I think is really interesting is it resists being a sonnet. So we have 15 lines here, which slightly exceeds our sonnet shape. And we do have a slightly longer line length, but it's not iambic pentameter. So we're using a little bit of the shape of a sonnet, but blowing that form, which also might communicate something about the fracture that exists within this particular character and makes a statement about that identity. What strikes you about this poem or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is an excerpt from John Ernest's book, Chaotic Justice. I want to read an excerpt from the introductory chapter called Loosed Cannons, the Race for Literary History. I want to read the epigraph that helps set the tone, and then the overview of the introduction. People who are looking for a lot of interesting ideas and hope to dabble here for a little more offend the author and degrade themselves. They would do well to stop now. Those who read in order to take action on their consequent beliefs, these are the only readers I respect or look for. Atrocities real and repeated proliferate within this social order. The deepest of all lies is our will not to respond to what we see before us. Jonathan Kozel. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Now I want to read the overview section in the introduction to give you a better sense of the argument that John Ernest makes. One thing that you might need to know is that this book was inspired by trying to come to understand Iola Leroy by Frances Harper. I approached the interrelated issue of race, identity, literary scholarship, and literary history in separate chapters, although the chapters are intended to supplement one another in various ways. When I first laid out my plan for this book, a friendly reader summarized my overall goals. I understand him to be looking for a model that accounts for the local contingencies and shifting tensions and bases of micro and macro racial relations at any given moment, and the interplay between historical accounting and the political and professional contingencies and desire of particular representational moments in the development of our account of African American literature. Well, that is it exactly, but also a mouthful, and some unpacking might be useful. In the following chapters, then, I try to focus on key issues in this overall model without losing sight of the dynamic interplay among them. I begin by offering a framework for interpreting the dynamic process of racial history in our first chapter, representing chaos and reading race. Basically, I draw from chaos theory to argue against a simple ideological understanding of racial history, and to explain the fractal dimensions of 19th century African American approaches to narrative. But the chapters prepare me as well for the challenges of constructing a narrative history of that literature. I am particularly interested in African American experiences and the conceptualizations of racial theory. Though my principal assumption is that all racial history in the United States has emerged from attempts to define and promote a white supremacist social order. African Americans, quite insightful about those attempts, found themselves charting different racial paths involving different understandings and appropriations of racial culture. Following their lead, I suggest that we have barely begun to map the racial past. That doing so is a major challenge to any approach to African American history, literary or otherwise, and that chaos theory offers a useful framework for constructing such maps. Central to my argument are two applications of chaos theory. The first is my contention that the history of race is not neatly ideological. Rather, it is a complex series of contingent events and cultural currents, both directing and directed by shifting racist ideologies. Racism, Alexander Saxton has written, is a theory of history. I would add that it is a theory that leads not only to a narrative of progress, but also to the importance of process. The attempt to identify and negotiate, constantly again, the active manifestations of a history of race marked by reoccurring patterns and shifting contingencies. My second application of chaos theory relates to the attempt to represent racial history in 19th century African American literature. Ultimately, I draw from chaos theory to examine an early African American poetics informed by the need to represent overwhelming complexity. A poetics that resembles efforts in chaos theory to represent a world, both natural and social, that escapes the clean lines of Euclidean approaches. African Americans understood that the racial dynamics shaping virtually every area of their collective lives were irreducible to a simple theory of racial prejudice or racism. In other words, they recognized that claims and views about the embodiment of race were merely the most visible aspects of the broader racial problems they faced. In this way, they became intimately involved in the more familiar understanding of chaos. What Clifford Geertz had in mind when he observed that there are at least 3 points where chaos, a tumult of events which lack not just interpretation, but interpretability, threatens to break in upon man at the limits of his analytic capacities, at the limits of his powers of endurance, and at the limits of his moral insight. African Americans had sustained experience with all 3 points, and they would have understood well Geertz's following. Bafflement, suffering, and the sense of untractable ethical paradox are all. If they become intense enough or are sustained long enough, radial challenges to the appropriation that life is comprehensible and that we can, by taking thought, orient ourselves effectively within it. However, African American expressive culture is eloquent testimony to the fact that many did find ways to orient themselves with a comprehensible life, if only by creating a body of thought and expression capable of dealing with the limits of understanding and the shifting contingencies of life. They did so in part by finding ways to represent the larger realities of race. That is, the race inscribed in social institutions, practices, and processes. The racial dynamics that made life unpredictable in its specifics, but broadly predictable, within certain realms of possibility and probability, in its ever-emerging and reoccurring patterns. They became, in effect, theorists of chaotic dynamics and process. The racial dynamics that framed and influenced African American experience leads to the second chapter. Truth Stranger Than Fiction, African American Ideology, and the Autobiography. What were the challenges of representing African American lives in the 19th century? And how should an awareness of those challenges direct our reading of slave narratives and other autobiographical and biographical texts? Here I explore those challenges as they pertain to the dynamics of African American identity and to the frameworks for moral agency in promoting reform through the stories of one's life. I consider as well the importance of the sheer variety of autobiographical texts. The fact that multiple versions of some narratives were produced, that almost every narrative raises significant questions about points of departure and points of arrival, that some were written by white authors, and that some are challenging hybrid narratives. Novelized autobiography, as William Andrews has argued. Locating African American autobiographies, ideologically, generically, or even geographically, from Elizabeth Keckley's White House, for example, to Lewis Hughes's Milwaukee, is itself a challenge. The main purpose of this chapter is to explore the complexity of self or biographical representation, that is, the attempt to represent the African American lives central to any understanding of African American literature. How did the chaotic constructions of race shape individual lives? And what are the implications of these constructions for writers and readers of African American autobiographies and biographies? African American writers and the subjects of narratives by others faced the challenge of representing a life defined by race, resisting that definition while also cultivating community, negotiating the cultural politics of readership and of occasions for publication, and redirecting the trajectory of possibilities of and settings for African American identity. Addressing these many hurdles led many writers not only to novelize their narratives, but also to fictionalize their lives and their worlds so as to get at the realities of a world defined by race that was barely apprehended by white writers and readers. How then does the complexity of African American life writing both complicate and direct our approach to African American literary history? The consideration of African American life writing and biography naturally raises questions about how we locate these lives and the texts they produce, both culturally and in scholarship. This is the subject of the third chapter, the shortest point between two lines, writing African Americans into American literary history. With the increasing accessibility of affordable editions of many 19th century African American texts supporting ongoing developments in scholarship, many practitioners who pursue the broader field of American literary and cultural studies are naturally interested in placing African American writers in conversation with other writers. Nonetheless, despite the increased scholarly attention to 19th century African American writers over the past 2 decades, studies still turn on a largely familiar story about the nature and significance of African American literature and about its place in American literary history. We have yet to fully confront Eric Sundquist's sense of the challenge of revising the contours of literary tradition, nor have we come to terms with the necessity of living with the paradox that American literature is both a single tradition of many parts and a series of winding, sometimes parallel traditions that have perforce been built in good part from their inherent conflicts. In this chapter, I observed that the winding paths of those traditions remain largely uncharted, and I discussed the dangers of assuming that African American and white writers can easily be brought into conversation with one another. In the absence of a radical reconsideration, not only for literary history, but also the cultural work of literature in the face of the instabilities of cultural identity, placing Black and white authors together, or even categorizing different African American writers according to established historical paradigms, amounts to a ritualized reenactment of the protocols of U.S. racial history. I argue then that such conversations need to be negotiated among different cultural spaces and different historical continuums, and that such negotiations return our attention to a concept of African American literature that includes but extends beyond the identity of its authors. Those continuums were shaped in part by the laws, both juridical and social, restricting or otherwise directing the lives of African Americans in the 19th century. These laws are the focus of the 4th chapter, Choreographing Chaos, African American Literature in Time and Space, which examines the ways in which African American experience in the 19th century was shaped by laws of time, laws of mobility, and laws of affiliation. The negotiation of such laws plays a double role in many African American texts and their approaches to history, in the perspectives afforded by both domestic and international travel, and in their attempts to envision the terms of a stable ideological and political community. This double role is seen at the level of experience and at the level of literary representation, which I identify as the attempt to choreograph African American experience and its functions in social space and time. In each case, a legal code regulating African American lives defines the environment that African American writers attempt to address. The chapter concludes with a prominent example of a double negotiation of social forces and possibilities. The story of William and Ellen Craft's escape from slavery and William's subsequent representation of that journey in Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. The 5th chapter, The Story at the End of the Story, African American Literature and the Civil War, follows these negotiations to the dramatic cultural shift that characterized life during and after Reconstruction. Here I apply the arguments of the previous chapters to a case study of African American literary history. The Civil War was, among other things, a conflict of various narratives, national, regional, religious, and racial. Its influence on American literature was profound, as various studies have demonstrated. It was also a time when the significance and centrality of race in the United States was variously exposed and veiled. And in the wake of that conflict, the course of racial history was altered in significant ways. Following the Civil War, the racial presence in literature by white Americans became increasingly pronounced. Regional and national narratives were newly intertwined, and the forums for constructing and presenting national and literary history were becoming increasingly institutionalized. For African Americans, the Civil War was both the fulfillment of a collective narrative of liberation and justice and, following Reconstruction, a forceful reminder of the limitations of a linear, progressive narrative of history. African American autobiography changed dramatically after the Civil War, because it now operated both outside of an anti-slavery context and with a newly threatening and profoundly complex racial environment. And as conceptions of the possibilities for self-representation changed, so did African American approaches to literature generally. But this is not simply a historical break separating antebellum and postbellum writers. For some, the most prominent African American authors of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, Francis Harper, and Martin Delany, among others, wrote and published both before and after the Civil War and Reconstruction, highlighting the difficult transition into a newly chaotic narrative landscape. Anthologies typically struggle to represent this transition, usually placing these writers in the antebellum period, and literary histories generally follow the national narrative in defining the significant periods of African American literary production. In this chapter, then, I argue that the literature produced before and after the Civil War forces us to re-envision the course and terms of African American literary history by returning our attention to the historical contingencies that frame and continually reframe African American identity. Ultimately, African American writers of this time are rarely read as African Americans, that is, as members of the broader network of association, inhabitants of an identifiable historical continuum. Understanding the contingencies of African American identity remains important, and such readings involve a disruption of the usual approaches to historical context and interpretation. What follows the end of the story? In a brief conclusion, I review the historical demands upon African American authors and the demands upon the readers of African American literature, emphasizing the contingencies of authorship, readership, and social action. The question is not whether African American literature will continue to be read, for all signs indicate its continued popularity. Rather, the question is how this literature will be changed by its readers, and whether the reading will justify any mention of an African American literary tradition. In short, will we draw from this chaotic literature to address injustice or avoid it? Consider here as well are the implications of my argument that racial history cannot be ignored or transcended, and that African American literature is uniquely capable of charting a course through that historical terrain in ways that can enable us to reconceptualize current political and ideological debates. The stakes, it seems to me, are high, especially in a time when even prominent advocates of the political left are talking about the trouble with diversity and using simplistic and largely ahistorical concepts of race to argue for the priorities of an equally simplistic concept of social class. In To the Wake of Nations, Eric Sundquist reminds us that value is not solely an aesthetic criterion, and that it cannot be severed from justice and therefore from politics. For his concept of justice, he turns to Patricia Williams's useful formulation. Justice, she contends, is a continual balancing of competing visions, plural viewpoints, shifting histories, interests, and allegiances. To acknowledge that level of complexity is to require, to seek, and to value a multiplicity of knowledge systems, in pursuit of a more complete sense of the world in which we all live. Joining Sundquist with Williams, I would add that justice cannot be ahistorical, and we cannot afford to think of it as a goal for the future. Justice is not the result of the continual balancing of competing visions and shifting histories that Williams speaks of. Justice is a measure of how we manage that balancing process. In 1855, Frederick Douglass, assessing the force of white supremacist assumptions within the anti-slavery movement, complained about the self-appointed generals of the anti-slavery host, the Euclids, who are theoretically working out the most insoluble problem of our future destiny. These many years later, we cannot afford to leave either literary history or social justice in the hands of those who favor Euclidean models of social process. We will need to attend carefully to what is a central concept in the chapters that follow. Saida Hartman's formulation of the community, or the networks of affiliation constructed in practice. Communities that are to be understood, Hartman argues, not by a simple narrative of race, but rather in terms of the possibilities of resistance conditioned by relations of power and the very purposeful and self-conscious effort to build community. In short, we will need to account for a chaotic history if we are to have any hope of envisioning and working toward the realization of what I'm calling chaotic justice, a historically informed, ongoing negotiation of the overwhelming complexity and vicissitudes of a society shaped by the ideologies of race. The work ahead involves not the celebration, but the application, indeed, the activation, of the documents bequeathed us by history, documents capable of guiding us to the future by guiding us through the past. One of the things I appreciate most about this particular book is not only the argument that it makes, but also the way it's crafted. Ernest opens every chapter with an epigraph, and the epigraph helps us set a tone and helps us condense the message. So with that, we get a snapshot of what this chapter is going to be about and the tone it intends to set or take. One of the other things that I really appreciate about this particular book and the way this particular author engages with the reader is we get acknowledgement that this is quite heady material, that it's quite dense and quite complex. Ernest gives us a description from a friendly reader, and that description is quite dense, quite heavy, and quite complex. And he acknowledges that immediately after that so-called elevator version of what he's trying to argue. And then he begins to unpack it. And much like the authors and the texts that he's reviewing, he's also capitalizing on this fracture element. So throughout the book, he breaks that wall where he's acknowledging some of the anxieties that any reader may have. It helps take the fear out of something that is quite complex and has the potential to be quite intimidating. And that's something that this author does really well, is this back and forth engagement between the scholarly, and appealing to the lay reader. So in this text, we see the author embracing those fractures, not trying to soften them or bury them, but really highlighting and calling our attention to it. And this shows us an even deeper understanding of the kind of content that he's talking about. So I really appreciate the craft of this academic piece. What strikes you about this author's argument or another text by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called A Normal Walk by Michael Don from his collection Partners and Strangers. Until we sipped it down, the coffee sloshed out of our mugs and onto the sleeves of our fall jackets. It was just a walk, a normal walk around the neighborhood. I led the way. I turned down the newer, sunny streets with sidewalks and young couples with small children, and avoided those with old maples holding on to their browning leaves. The mid-November air quickly chilled the coffee, even though it wasn't what mid-November air used to be. We drank the coffee happily. Happy to have mouths that drank, legs that walked, hands that held things. The sun warmed our backs and necks. It radiated through our cores and out our limbs. It tickled our brains in a way that made us want to comment on whatever was in front of us. A nicely landscaped lawn, a low front tire, a toddler helping her dad push her baby sister's stroller. We were happy to have so much of it in front of us. As usual, we made our way to the pond. We had learned to find it beautiful, even though 20 years ago, this same man-dug ditch filled with piped-in water had us longing for either rural or urban surroundings. Somewhere with natural bodies of water or ones every bit intended to look man-made. For years, the suburban in-between had us unnerved, unsettled, anxiously looking around for escape routes. A pair of wading ducks took off into the air once we got too close. He was amazed. He claimed he'd never seen ducks fly. Not once in his 51 years, but we had seen ducks fly just last week, and he'd grown up on a farm surrounded by pond. They're great flyers, I said. They could cross an ocean. You know what? He said. This pond would be perfect for ice skating. I told him I'd never ice skated on a pond, and he said that he used to do it all the time as a pudgy teenager until the time he slipped and hit his head and was raced to the emergency room 15 miles down the road. Of course, I'd heard that story 8 or 10 or 12 or 23 times, but he'd also already heard me say I'd never ice skated on a pond 9 or 13 or 22 times. It was normal, a couple battling back and forth the same stories over several decades, each repeat sandwiched telling between new and unrepeatable moments. We kept on, putting one foot in front of the other, our non-coffee drinking arms loose and free at our sides, a gentle breeze breaking across our faces. Everything felt good. We passed other walkers. One woman had a giant dog. Neither of us knew what kind it was, but he said he liked very small dogs, and I said I liked very big dogs. Of course, we already knew this about each other. We were finally planning to replace Felix, who was our black lab, the only pet we ever had as a family, his legacy becoming grander by the day. We'd visited the rescue shelter 3 times now, each time quickly pulled towards different breeds. Maybe you should get 2, the teenage girl volunteer suggested on our most recent trip with an earnestness that was slightly more refreshing than irritating. At the top of the hill, once we recovered our breaths, he said, I talked to Hannah this morning. I'm worried about her. We had almost named our daughter Hannah, but once we spent a few moments with her, once we heard her cry and felt the warmth of her tiny grip, and saw the way she looked at us, we agreed her name should be Elsie. Hannahs sprang into the world ready to take on whatever came their way with temerity. Elsie's were apprehensive and deliberate and sensitive. Sometimes he called her Jake, our son's name, but he had been doing this since they were young, and he always caught himself. Oh, I said. She doesn't sound like herself. Who? I said. My mind had wandered to Jake's girlfriend. They had visited last week, and though she tried hard, complimenting the wild garden and herbaceous cooking and the cheerful color of our bathroom walls, there was something, she said, that lingered. Her parents, she said, had been high school sweethearts, but they were still happy together. The still troubled me. It was even obvious to a skinny, eyeshadow-wearing 19-year-old, who would be one of the many girlfriends we would meet, that partners living happily together over multiple decades defied all odds. Or maybe it simply embarrassed her that her parents had never had certain kinds of experiences. Elsie, he said impatiently, school's too much these days. How can you take 6 classes and expect to have fun? The brain can't work under that kind of pressure. She has no confidence. She's not sniffing out her true passion. She still wants to be pre-med. The brain can't work. She'll find her passion, I said. And if she doesn't, she'll still have a good life. We made out okay. We didn't worry about Jake. He got worse grades than Elsie, but he always managed to meet the right people and follow his interests, which as far as we could tell were money and people. He landed summer internships and was always invited on vacation with his friends' families. But Elsie was very serious. She needed to feel she had purpose bigger than her own fulfillment. When she was a little girl, she said she wanted to be a teacher because it was important that children learned so that they could know things. As a teenager, she wanted to be a journalist because the truth mattered more than anything. And now she wanted to be a doctor because she did well in high school biology, and how else would she pay back college loans? And she would like people to depend on her. I could remember once having a similar desire. There were 3 turns to get home. A right, then a left, then another left. I led the way. I was always a half step ahead. I'd finished my coffee and dangled the mug at my waist. Only my pointer finger wrapped around the handle. He continued to sip from his mug and wipe his mouth on his wrist. We passed by a man in his 30s, scooping up leaves with a frisbee while a Scottish terrier sprinted circles around the yard. We exchanged hellos. Everyone said hello in our neighborhood, but conversation rarely went further unless you had a dog with you. Now that's a nice dog, he said once we were out of earshot of the terrier's owner. Reminds me of Felix. We're done with Felix. We need a dog who will surprise us. Surprise us, he repeated. Then maybe we could get a macaw, like our friend down by the bike path. Are you kidding? We'd have to get 2, and write them into our wills. Do you really want your pets talking to you? I guess it depends. We could get a whole new perspective on what's going on in our lives. He laughed a little. I'm glad you're always you, I said, smiling. I'll never be anyone else, he said. That much I can promise. It was said both jokingly and seriously, and I was robbing the cradle. The 3 years between us were big back then. My mother feared his eye would wander to younger women earlier than expected. She never said this explicitly, but it's not hard for a daughter to read between the lines. The same way Elsie complained that she knew I had a hard time imagining her in the exam room, even though I always told her I thought she'd make a great neurologist or cardiologist if that was what she wanted to do. Now here we were, 30 years later, happy enough in the suburbs, 2 young adult children, our child rearing near finished. Roles would begin to reverse sooner than later. And he, my beloved husband, was calling our daughter by the wrong name. It was funny how one day you had a plan that you were so serious about, and then before you knew it, decades had passed, and you realized how silly it was to have a plan, to try to control anything. And now you were happy to go for walks and talk to your kids on the phone. But there was still something in you that wanted to reach forward for an old plan. And when you thought about it, it became a desperate kind of reach because what you had left in front of you could only get smaller. So you said to your husband, in your front yard while brushing up against your dried up peony stalks, before the walk was over, because once you were inside, you would retreat to your office and he would go to his reading chair. A house you loved and never wanted to leave, but the idea of dying in it made you all kinds of disappointed. Let's get the hell out of here. He'd heard you say this many times before, but always unconvincingly. Ready to argue against yourself, the emphasis on hell. But this time he heard the emphasis on out, and he noted your eyes were not squinting playfully. Or maybe he looked at your empty mug and saw one last drop of coffee at the brim and decided it was a sign. Before it's too late, he said, trying his best to make it sound more like a question than a declaration. One of the things I appreciate most about this particular piece is the way it engages with aging and the onset of something like Alzheimer's. Although we don't get a formal declaration of that's what's going on, we get enough hints through the interactions between these characters and the reflection of the narrative eye toward the end that suggests that this is something approaching. And rather than seeing this as something that's inescapable, they decide or they resolve that they're going to leave. So I think this is an interesting way to deal with something that seems insurmountable. And that creates a lot of tension in the story and a lot of transformation. What did you find most interesting about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called You Can Get a Tea Towel Like That. by Marianne Samyn from her book Beauty Breaks In. Beauty breaks in everywhere. Welcome to the wind-powered poem. Like the ocean or the woodcut of the ocean, I heard the hardest things and listened. Syntax says, you first. Shimmer half scolds. I said, I am loved. Sometimes a correction happens. Fear made it 1 full week. A human action. I stopped making it worse than it was. One of the things that I admire most about this particular poem is actually the absence of narrative in it, the way that the author maintains some sense of mystery. So it kind of reminds me of jazz. It's not just about the notes that you do play, it's also about the ones that we don't play. And we get that in Samyn's poem. One of the lines that strike me in particular is the line third from the bottom. I said, I am loved. Sometimes a correction happens. And I think this is a critical line in the poem. This gives us some sense of what the narrative is hinting toward. It gives us a catalyst for what the narrative we don't necessarily see is about. It hints toward it without giving too much away. But we're not playing it so close to the vest that the reader can't resonate with it. So what we get here is accomplishing a mood or a tone really effectively through the use of language as opposed to narrative. What strikes you most about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Grocery Shopping with Helen Mirren by Andrew Bode-Lang, and it's from his collection Field Trips with Exceptional People. Where are the coconuts? She says. They must be somewhere. Look, here are the mangoes. You can't tell me they don't keep the coconuts somewhere near the mangoes. It's absurd. I'm looking all over the produce section. We haven't been here long. What about over there? I say, by the bananas. She picks up a star fruit and turns it between her surprisingly long fingers. No one would put coconuts near the bananas. I feel somewhat foolish for suggesting it. I also feel foolish because I can't name a single thing Helen has been in. I just know I like her better than Meryl Streep. I'm glad Meryl couldn't come. First Meryl said she would, then she said she wouldn't, then she said she would, and anyhow, this morning when I showed up, it was just Helen and me. Hang on, I say. I've got an idea. Helen looks surprised by the fact that I've had an idea, if I correctly understand her look. But I go ahead and boldly cross the produce section, weaving my way around enormous wooden crates piled with apples and tomatoes. Near the bulk bins of baby spring mix and arugula, I find a young produce man with a chipped tooth and faint acne scars on his cheeks. He comes back with me. Well, I think they ought to be right here, he says to Helen and me. I mean, we always have the coconuts right here by the mangoes, not by the bananas, I say. He gives me a withering look. No one will put coconuts near the bananas. Helen brightens. That's what I told him, she says, jerking her thumb at me. I've had to tell him things like that all morning. He's hopeless, the produce man says. He's much taller than I am. I've just noticed it now. You're telling me, Helen throws the produce man a winning smile. You know, I could swear we have more coconuts in the back. Let me go and check. Oh no, I couldn't trouble you. Please, it's no trouble. Truly, I couldn't bother you to go all the way back there. I go back there looking for things all the time. She puts her hand on his arm. No, really, I insist. Please don't go. I swear we have some coconuts, he says. I can bring out a whole box for you. No, she says firmly. She gives me an intentional look as if she wants me to learn something from this. But she's still speaking to him. I don't really need a coconut. I just felt like one. What I really like about this piece is the way that the author navigates restricted page space by limiting the location. So this piece only takes place in the grocery store. We're already at the grocery store. We're not traveling to the grocery store, but we know a little bit about what happens before we got there. We know that there's supposed to be another person here. Meryl Streep's supposed to show up, but she didn't. And that, to some degree, makes the narrator happy. As the narrative eye says, not really a huge fan of Meryl Streep, but also that's less bodies to deal with. That's less people to navigate. So we're in this one location and we don't leave this location. So this is one strategy that I know that I'll be using moving forward in my own work in order to navigate restrictive page space, is to limit the scene location, try not to switch, and pack as much detail as I can into that particular moment, those few moments that I've selected. So we're in a very narrow window of time as well. An average trip to the grocery store maybe takes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes to an hour. And that's all we're covering in this space. That's the detail that we get. Another thing that I really love about this piece is the way the author uses dialogue to establish a sense of character voice and context really quickly. So most of this conversation, we open on dialogue, we end on dialogue, and this helps create a sense of coming full circle. And we get more details about the characters. And when we're doing something in first person narration, often something that's really difficult to communicate is the gender of that narrative eye. And we get part of that through dialogue when Helen Mirren is talking to the produce man, when she says he's impossible and she jerks her thumb at the narrator, so indicating that this person is masculine, that she's come to the store with. So these are some of the things that I really appreciate about this particular piece, and I will be using moving forward in my own writing. What strikes you about this particular piece, Grocery Shopping with Helen Mirren, or another work by this author? What will you take moving forward? Tell me in the comments below. This is called The Altered State of Stuffed Animals. It's by William J. Cobb, and it was published in Superstition Review. My daughter cohabits with approximately 427 stuffed animals. If this were like the early days of the Book of Genesis, and the skies were to open and deluge us with 40 days and 40 nights of rain, we could repopulate the earth with our own Noah's Ark of stuffies. Only they wouldn't be alive, technically. That's actually a moot point. For my daughter, these animals are alive. She has an elaborate, invisible world that is populated with stuffed and make-believe beings, friends, and furniture. In this invisible world, the animals rule. If a great flood were to come, she'd be ready, with her entire troop. I can imagine her drawing up the plans for her animal boat, although she'd want to know exactly what a cubit is. It would be called Lily's Ark, out of its founder's namesake. Names are important. My daughter knows this. She has named each and every one of her stuffies. Our most recent adoptions include a kangaroo mother with her Joey, Rosa Parks, and little baby Washington. These were rescues from a gift shop at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. We also adopted a giant squid, James Earl Baxter, and a honey badger, Hamilton, who was my choice. One of her dragons, we have several, is Jojo Silly Billy, who makes a strange gargling growl if you squeeze his paw. I confess my favorite of all is a rather large penguin named Aquatica Mortimer. He was adopted into the family at a SeaWorld amusement park in San Antonio, Texas. I hated SeaWorld. Really, truly hated. It was the worst kind of consumer world scam. Overpriced, overrated, a total ripoff. Even the sea otters seemed offended. If you could glimpse their whiskered faces from the boredom of their yawns during the hokey performances, sea otter slaves is what they were. On the day we visited, as far as I could tell, SeaWorld was merely a rather elaborate water-themed giant gift shop. The killer whales, one of the main draws, like lions at safari parks, were on break. We couldn't see them, but I imagined them in a back room smoking cigarettes and doing tequila shots, talking about which trainers they'd like to hold under the water just a little too long. On the other hand, Lily loves SeaWorld. Her idea of vacation is an endless stream of gift shops, as long as they were well stocked with stuffed animals. We have visited Yellowstone National Park many times in her 8 years of existence. The first time came before she was 2. She has backpacked there several times, including more than once hiking 6 miles on her rather short little girl legs, doing a good job of keeping up with the grown-ups. One of her most memorable moments, while we were making dinner around the campfire in the Imperial Geyser Basin, not far from the famous Firehole River, a large buffalo, or American bison, walked right through our camp. It was almost close enough to touch. We didn't know what to do. We didn't even see it coming until it was quite close. We looked into its eyes and froze. It kept walking. After it was 50 paces from our camp, it lay on its back and squirmed, scratching its back, like dogs do. Lily was thrilled, and still talks about it to this day. She keeps trying to tell the story the right way, again and again, in various journal entries. Most of them involve some form of the sentence, "A buffalo walked through our camp." She calls an exclamation point a gusto mark, and uses them liberally. All these gift shops and stuffed animal buying come with an emotional cost. Once, in Glacier National Park, at the Two Medicine Lodge, we love the name, gift shop, Lily clamored for a little stuffed animal, Lynx, which I didn't want to buy for her. We had already bought her a number of stuffies on that trip, and at that moment, I thought it was one too many. She pouted and sulked. It wasn't expensive, $5 or $8, I believe, and I gave in. Then I became angry with her for not saying thank you. On the return to our camp, I pouted and sulked. I still feel bad about that. Yes, I should not spoil her in principle. I don't want her to become another Veruca Salt, that pretty brat from Ronald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, who is, by the way, one of Lily's favorite characters. But she's not. She can pout and sulk and get over it within minutes. I can too. But I realize I shouldn't let anger get the best of me. Shouldn't pout or sulk like an 8-year-old. Still. When I'm angry and I feel like William Hurt in Altered States 1980, a cult film from the 80s, an adaptation of Paddy Chayefsky's novel 1978, in Altered States, Hurt starts as an anthropology professor who messes around with sensory deprivation tanks and does hallucinogenic drugs. A kind of handsome Carlos Castaneda dude, as it were. So much that he undergoes a kind of reverse evolution, a de-evolution, although not like the 70s punk band Devo. We are not men, we are Devo. And becomes an ape-like creature, a Homo erectus perhaps, terrorizing the zoo and one comely graduate assistant in his bed. Well, he doesn't actually terrorize her. In one scene, his throat goes all wonky with muscles, as do his arms and legs too, as he grows a jutting brow and a great deal of body hair, so that he no longer has the ability to speak. He just grunts. That's what I feel like when I lose my cool, with its commiserate guilt/remorse. The animals help when I reach the stage of de-evolution. I confess that I sometimes buy forgiveness with the purchase of stuffed animals. I know this is wrong, but still, I think it's not that wrong. If it's a sin, it's pretty minor. A venal one at best. I feel remorse for letting anger get the best of me. But seriously, as Lily wants to say, remorse for buying her another stuffed animal. Not much. It's been a constant chore, teaching her to be polite, good manners, and all. To say her please and thank yous. Friends and even strangers will remark to us how polite she is, and my wife and I are alike. You don't know the half of it. Discipline for us has been an ongoing task, fraught with turmoil and guilt and general success. I wish I could say I never raised my voice. I wish. We don't spank her, thank God. I can't even imagine the guilt that would haunt me if I did. Once I asked married with children friends of ours if they ever spanked their children, and their mother replied rather haughtily, "We never hit our children." Touché, and persuasive. Who wants to be the parent who proclaims, when my child doesn't do what I ask, I hit her? So we don't. Instead, we reprimand. We nag, we repeat ourselves a lot. No doubt we cause emotional pain, but at least the bruises are on her psyche. I'm not sure which is worse. Wait, scratch that. Physical punishment is worse. Definitely. I just wish it could all be avoided. Choose your poison. Lily is an only child. I don't really like that term, but it's accurate, I guess. There's an implication of being spoiled, probably in a way. but also of somehow pampered, unrealistic. What is realistic? There are lots of only children in the world. Many, if not most, of Lily's friends are also only children. Back in the day, say Kansas during the Dust Bowl years, living in a sod house, covering the faces of the 15 children with gauze masks to keep out the dust. This was a rarity, when maybe tuberculosis was a common cause of death. But seeing as she doesn't have other siblings to spend time with, she gravitates to the animal world. She crawls around the floor daily, impersonating one animal or another. Yesterday she was a wolf pup. "They're so cute," she exclaimed. Variously, she has assumed the personalities of honey badgers, duck-billed platypuses, and black-footed ferrets. We often watch animal documentaries on PBS, nature series, and one of Lily's favorite morning shows is Wild Kratts, which is about a pair of brothers saving animals. One of her drawings recently was of a cotton-top tamarin, a kind of monkey with a great white hairdo, thanks to Wild Kratts. With all of this input, she knows a great deal of arcane information about the animal world. She knows, for instance, that it is considered good luck in Africa to see a scaly pangolin, and that they're on the endangered species list. She knows that the giant squids, like giant pandas, aren't actually giant, but we like the name. Colossal squids are even larger. She knows that one should never ever run from a bear. On a backpacking trip along the Belcher River in Yellowstone, she witnessed a young black bear cross the river. She believes it is wrong to hunt or kill animals in any way. We are, after all, animals ourselves, as she likes to point out. Perhaps she does take this to an extreme degree. She hides fly swatters, won't even let me use an ant powder. I feel bad about using poison too, but I do it anyway. I'm not thrilled to have ants in the house. As she pointed out during our recent trip, the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History is really a dead zoo, or an elaborate display of stuffed animals. A marvelous mausoleum of dead animals, with no less than 2 embalmed giant squid. Octopus, gnus, bison, phylodons, saber-toothed cats, warthogs, you name it. Entire rooms full of skulls and skeletons, the Louvre of lost animals. I wouldn't have been surprised to find the Hall of Livers and Kidneys. That's where we adopted Rosa Parks and little baby Washington, 2 fine members of our 672 stuffed animals. We've purchased some new ones since the start of this paragraph. Thankfully, most of our stuffed animal encounters do not involve reprimanding, feeling guilty, or forgiveness. Mostly they involve cuddling, and sometimes minor heroics, quests no less. Like the time we drove 90 miles to rescue the lost Billy nanny goat. We were on a road trip where many of our mishaps occurred. We had to visit an AutoZone in Colorado Springs and swung by the shop to take care of this chore at the outset of the trip to Yellowstone National Park and points north. After accomplishing our task, we had a picnic lunch on the grassy knoll beside a busy avenue under some trees. Is this crazy or what? A picnic lunch beside a busy avenue. Well, the timing was right. We'd already been driving over an hour to get there, and the avenue wasn't that busy. The sky was blue, the air fresh. We enjoyed ourselves. Lily sat against a tree at the outset of the picnic. Billy Nanny Goat was on her lap. Life was sublime. An hour later, approaching the outskirts of Denver, Castle Rock, Colorado, Lily burst into tears. What's wrong? Billy Nanny Goat. He's gone. I left him on the ground. He's all alone. He doesn't know anyone there. I'm driving. Interstate 25, speed limit 75. I'm doing 80, no doubt. It's the law of West or wherever. Always add 5 miles to an hour to whatever the speed limit, and you're cool. Lily is weeping inconsolably in the back seat, beside her aunt, my sister, who had given her the stuffy. That day. A brand new stuffy left on the side of the road for any thug to come along and steal. An exit appeared. At that speed, I have microseconds to react. Are you sure he's there? I asked. Lily nodded. I put him behind my back to keep him warm, right against the tree. Note the particularity, the specificity, if you will, of her memory. I try to teach my writing students this mantra, be specific. Lily's specific memory was convincing. I flicked the turn signal. You're not doing what I think you're doing, said my wife. I was. There were reasons, good reasons, not to turn around. We were trying to get through Denver, a hard task that, before rush hour. We were on time, A return trip from that distance, I immediately calculated we'd gone over 45 miles from the AutoZone. Would add an hour and a half at least. The atmosphere in the car was tense, each of us locked in our own imaginary scenarios. What if we drove all the way back and no Billy Nanny Goat? What if someone had stolen him? True, he was a handsome little goat, but kidnappers, really? Maybe she had not left him there at all. Maybe we would make it back to the AutoZone and no Billy Nanny Goat. His disappearance would become a mystery, like Sasquatch or the Chupacabra. Nobody would say a word. Lily quit crying, but she didn't smile. She sniffled a little, looked worried. He's all alone, she whispered more than once. And he was, all alone. By the time we neared the AutoZone, rhymes with all alone, I was steeling myself to move on, counsel Lily about what we lose in life, how it wasn't her fault, and so on. It was an hour out of the way on a day of driving that was already close to 500 miles distance, even without this stuffed animal rescue detour. But oh well. Traffic was brisk. The AutoZone parking lot was mostly empty, and there, beneath the tree, in clear view of our windows, sat a small stuffed animal, Billy Nanny Goat, waiting patiently for the family who had driven off without him. Lily smiled. There he is, just like I said. That was the first day of a 2-week vacation to Yellowstone and Glacier National Park, a trip in which most everything seemed to go well. I like to think we were blessed by Billy's rescue. If we had not returned, we would have been cursed. Logically, perhaps, there's no connection. But what is logic to do about a little girl with fat tears in the back seat weeping for the goat she left behind? What I like most about this particular piece is the personification of the stuffed animals. They also reveal more about the living characters in the piece, the characters that were the center focus. Through these stuffed animals, they become a catalyst to tell us more about the narrator and his relationship with his daughter, his relationship to the stuffed animals, and also the daughter's relationship to these stuffed animals. So it becomes a really strong way to help us transition through different moments in time and shows us growth of these characters through these stuffed animals and their relationships. I also think that the language is really interesting and entertaining, how we're getting these authorial intrusions of the lyric interior, so these internal thoughts, as we're getting the explanations for these different events. And I think this becomes a really good way to show that connection to the human condition or the human experience. What did you find most interesting about this particular piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Grammars Across Appalachia by Kirk Hazen, and it's from his edited collection, Appalachian Englishes in the 21st Century. So I'm going to read just the summary and the introduction, and then I'm going to skip to the conclusion. This chapter reviews the scholarship on grammar variation in Appalachia with an eye to which dialect features have persisted in the 21st century. Traditional scholarship on grammar patterns describe the types of morphological and syntactical variation, yet both diachronic and synchronic trends provide insight into grammar's uneven patterns. Stereotypical portrayals of Appalachia use the most vernacular and thereby showy types of grammar, such as the A prefix in she's a fishing. These grammatical patterns vary widely in how often they are actually used. Despite the increased attention Appalachian Englishes have received in the last 2 decades, many of the traditional forms in the literature of grammatical variation have not been well studied lately, and these areas of research are ripe for future study. For example, variation in irregular past tense verb forms such as come/came, seen/saw, and sneak/snuck have not had any kind of quantitative assessment, but are often topic of public interest. For language change, a grammatical feature's stigma has guided who maintains which forms. Developments in grammar patterns at the end of the 20th century and future trends are also discussed. Introduction. Many people see grammar as one of the real problems in Appalachia. They might describe the vowels of hill and mine as lilting, or the innovative consonant of warsh as quaint. But a sentence like, "them squirrels wasn't no good," is out of line for most folks. They feel it requires correction. Linguists study sentences like these to find patterns in the words and their ordering. In those patterns, we find regular human language, just like all other varieties on Earth. When biologists study sea creatures, they do not find whales to be faulty swimmers just because they do not swish their tails like fish. There are different ways to get the job done. Humans speak around 7,000 languages, and many more dialects of those languages. All of them work according to the brain's design, and because of their patterns, they are all grammatical. Linguists do recognize that some patterns are more socially stigmatized than others. The difference between grammatical and stigmatized is discussed in the next section. This chapter contains an explanation of linguists' ideas about grammar and subsections with explanations about some of the grammar patterns across Appalachia. There's not enough room to detail all the grammar patterns that linguists have studied over the last 100 years. For an extensive list, consult Michael Montgomery's Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English. Conclusion. People used many of the vernacular grammar patterns of Appalachia less and less often after World War II. Yet their decline does not necessarily indicate their demise. When the King James Bible was published in 1611, the editors included grammar patterns like the verb suffix th and the second person singular pronoun thou, thee, and thine. For most English speakers at the time, these forms were already fading out of use. They were becoming old-fashioned when it was published, and since that time, in the United States, these forms only show up in verse like, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, Revelations 17:15. Because these forms are normally experienced in hymns and Christian Bible verses, they are tightly associated with the genre. Grammar patterns like a-prefixing and demonstrative them are often experienced in representations of Appalachians and are connected to whatever social qualities people believe Appalachians have. Throughout the 20th century, especially after World War II, Appalachia felt the influence of increasingly ubiquitous external norms that were important from people moving in and out of the region and implemented through formal education. With these forces working on successive generations, stigmatized variants became less widely used and thus more distinctive of social group divisions. Grammatical variation will continue in Appalachian Englishes because they are living varieties, but the varieties of the 21st century will not be the same as those from the previous century. Instead of seeing grammar as one of the problems with Appalachian Englishes, linguists see grammar as an opportunity to study the complex and beautiful patterns of variation. What I like best about this piece is not only the argument, because it does add legitimacy to Appalachian Englishes, the way that we speak, the way that we structure our sentences, the syntax, and it calls attention to the ways in which language is used as a form of discrimination. And as a writer, this is something that I can use to create tension in my own work. One of the things I can do is not only use language as a way to identify my characters in terms of time period and place, but I can also use this awareness of language to create tension for my characters in rhetorical situations. This can add depth and complexity not only to my characters, but also the situations that I've plopped them in. What strikes you about this author's argument or another piece written by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called The Incurables, and it's by Mark Brazaitis. It's the title piece from his short story collection, The Incurables. When Adam Drew Drusevsky, aka Dickie DeLong, returned to his hometown of Sherman, Ohio, his old friend Barry Borkowski took him out for a beer at Don's Underground and raised a glass to the Prince of Corn. There was truth to the title. In the past decade, Drew had made more than 300 erotic films of varying length and quality. But his career, he told Barry, was over. I need a new life, Drew said. Can I have your current one? Barry asked. Drew didn't tell Barry he had herpes, which no medicine he'd taken and no diet he tried had prevented from erupting every couple of weeks like chickenpox of the penis. And he didn't confess to Barry his more troubling problem. Even after near overdoses of Viagra and every one of its pharmaceutical competitors, even after sucking back blenders full of supposed cock-hardening concoctions, Green Bananas, the woman in the oriental scarf and red eye patch, had told him. Sperm whale eyes, said the man with 3 gold rings on his lower lip even after 6 trips to the specialist in erectile dysfunction, which one of his former co-stars and former girlfriends, Misty Moans, called erectile dishonor. Even after praying to all the gods and all the false gods he knew, his penis remained paralyzed. Drew hoped to find something in his hometown that would return him to the man, the boy really, he'd once been. But 3 minutes into their conversation, Barry reminded him about how, when they were 12 years old, he'd stolen Playboy magazines from the Reeves drugstore and had simulated intercourse with the centerfolds on the floor of Barry's basement. "You were born a porn star," Barry said. Drew's father had died of a heart attack when Drew was 10 years old. His mother found Jesus soon after Drew told her what he was doing in California. She'd moved to Georgia 5 years ago in order to live closer to the television preacher whose show, she believed, had changed her life. Drew's paternal aunt, his only living relative in Sherman, set him up with a job at the Sherman Public Library. He was in charge of stacking books, cleaning the bathrooms, vacuuming the rugs, and rebooting the 4 computers in the children's section whenever their screens froze. In the first week on the job, no fewer than 3 library patrons asked him if they'd seen him before. "I grew up here," he told each of them. But 2 were recent arrivals to Sherman, and the 3rd said he was positive he had seen Drew on TV. Drew's blindingly blonde hair was hard to forget. It made him look Danish, thus his casting as Hamlet in Ophelia, nymph in thy orgasms. In his 2nd week, a woman who recognized him, and obviously knew why, grabbed her red-hatted toddler and fled the library as if he had exposed himself, herpes and all. During his 3rd week, he wore sunglasses. The head librarian, who, per the cliché, was bespectacled but had a body most of his former co-stars would have taken out a second mortgage on their souls to acquire, chided him for looking like a Secret Service agent and scaring the children. "Besides," she said, "you shouldn't hide such a pretty face." 2 days later, she invited him to dinner. Before he'd finished his salad, she smiled at him and, as her feet crawled up his leg, said, "I know what I want for dessert." He told her he was considering joining the priesthood. "But you're Jewish," she said. "I'm hoping they're desperate," he said. During his lunch break the next day, Drew did go talk with the priest at Our Lady of Perpetual Tears. Like the librarian, the priest pointed out the problem of Drew's religious affiliation. "And I'm not sure I understand your reasons for wanting to join the priesthood," he said. "Could you restate them plainly?" All Drew could think to say was, "I'm in a pit, and I'm reaching toward whatever light I see above me." Instead, he said, "I've forgotten." "Well, if you remember, come back," the priest said. "And why do I have this feeling I've seen you before?" On a Wednesday of his 6th week back in his hometown, Drew was supposed to meet Barry for drinks at Don's Underground. He was going to tell him everything, but Barry had left a message with the bartender saying he wouldn't be able to make it. After Drew finished his 4th beer, the bartender asked him if he was planning to drive home. "I'm on foot," Drew assured him, although he felt obligated to look down to make sure his feet hadn't deserted him. As he drank his 5th beer, Drew recalled, for perhaps the 200th time, a conversation he'd had with one of his former co-stars. In The Good, the Bed, and the Naughty, she had played maple syrup. She was what all the cowboys had with their breakfasts. Her screen name was Amber Waves. Before performing the climactic scene, a shootout followed by an orgy in Betty's bordello, they'd sat half-clothed on a red velvet couch. The smile she'd worn every time he saw her, on camera and off, vanished. She stuck out her hand and said, "My name is Aaron." After he'd introduced himself, she said, "You remind me of my stepfather. He had hair like yours. Like he'd stuck a paintbrush into the moon and swirled the colors all over his head." Her voice, high and childlike, like a cartoon duck's, made everything she said seem frivolous and inconsequential. "Well, let's not say the moon," Aaron amended. "I love the moon, and I didn't love him." Aaron gazed into his eyes. He was shocked by the intimacy of the gesture, and he bowed his head to look at his bare feet. "When I was 12, she said, "my stepfather raped me. It wasn't the last time. I've never told anyone." When Drew looked up at her, she was staring at him with the same fierce, shocking intimacy, and although neither of them moved, he felt the distance between them disappear. "What do you want me to do about it?" he said, although this wasn't what he wanted to say. She didn't reply. A moment later, It was time to shoot the scene. One morning, soon thereafter, Drew woke up to find his penis inert and covered with raging red blisters. "I'm on foot," he assured the bartender when, after finishing his 6th beer, he stumbled to the door of Don's Underground. He turned and waved. The bar had recently banned smoking, but nevertheless seemed suffused with a gray-green haze, the color of Los Angeles rush hour. Drew decided he wouldn't miss any of it. A minute later, he was standing in the middle of the pedestrian walkway on the Main Street Bridge, staring over the edge, wondering how far the fall was. Far enough, he decided. With both hands, Drew grabbed the topmost bar of the railing, which was a little higher than his chest. Slowly, he lifted his right leg and positioned his foot parallel to his hands. He looked like he was either preparing to kill himself or was warming up for a role in the Nutcracker or the Nutlicker. He played the Mouse King. "Good night," he said to the night. A hand clasped him on the shoulder. "Hello," said a man's voice. "I can't let you do what you're about to do." Drew, who hadn't noticed a police car pull up to stop in the middle of the bridge, returned his foot to the ground. "I think you could use some help, don't you agree?" said the man, who introduced himself as John Lewis, Sherman's sheriff. "You'll hear no argument from me," Drew said. The sheriff looked like Santa Claus without the beard. "Do I have your permission to take you to the hospital?" "Permission granted," Drew said, "but I'm incurable." In the Matthew A. Dunkirk Psychiatric Ward of the Ohio Eastern University Hospital, the nurse who registered him said without irony or apology as the Mad. Drew would be identified only by his first name and his photograph, which the nurse snapped in a red-curtained booth behind her desk. Despite his months of misery and tonight's drunkenness, a condition Sheriff Lewis said he would ignore because of rules prohibiting the inebriated from being admitted to the psych ward. His snapshot showed him looking raffish even, given the Valentine-covered backdrop, romantic. The nurse who did Drew's intake survey was named Herman, as in Herman's Hermits, Herman said. "But I don't suppose you know who I'm talking about." Drew did. One of his first film roles was the drummer of the Kinky in the British Invasion. Our music wasn't all that made him scream. "So what in your mind or spirit brought you tonight to the brink of welcoming eternity?" Herman asked. Drew named the reasons, although, as he did so, they seemed insubstantial. They didn't anyway appear insufficient to warrant a dive from the Main Street Bridge. But Herman nodded and nodded again. "Loss," he said, "of virility, of career, and your herpes is a reoccurring reminder of both." Herman had gray streaks in his hair and wrinkles at the edges of his eyes. He might have been old enough to be Herman Hermit himself, if there was such a person. "You have work to do," Herman said, "and drugs to take." Herman handed Drew a ham sandwich, which Drew ate in the ward's day room. The day room looked more suited to a children's center. The wallpaper featured a circus motif with pink elephants and baby blue lions. In the front of the room were a table with 6 chairs and a bookshelf with 24 Bibles, a deck of jumbo playing cards, and 5 board games, 3 of which were Chutes and Ladders. At the far end of the room, below a window with a view of the hospital's parking lot, and beyond it, Ohio Eastern University's football stadium, was a widescreen television. Sitting cross-legged in front of the TV was a woman about Drew's age, in pink pajamas, watching Winnie the Pooh. He focused on her hair, a color between blonde and brown. It had hundreds of corkscrews and was as short as a man's. When Eeyore the donkey appeared on the screen, the woman turned to Drew with exasperation and said, "You know what he needs, don't you?" Drew shook his head. "Electroshock," said the woman. "ECT, like me." She laughed. "I have my 6th treatment tomorrow." Her voice was a whisper. "Don't tell them, but number 5 put me in a mania. I'm feeling good right now. Are you single?" Drew knew he should be attracted to the woman, who was pale and slim and had small, strawberry-colored lips. Any heterosexual man in his right mind, and with functioning and unsullied equipment, he decided, would be. "Yes, I'm single." "Well, I'm not," she said, shrugging. She turned again to the TV. She diagnosed all the characters. Piglet needed anti-anxiety meds. Tigger had ADHD. And Pooh's a honey junkie, she said, sugared up but always thinking about his next fix. A nurse popped into the room to tell them it was 10 o'clock, time for lights out. "I'll see you tomorrow," Drew said to the curly-haired woman. "Only if I haven't escaped." So this place is locked? He asked. Where do you think you are? Replied the woman, smiling. The Four Seasons? Drew discovered he was sharing a room with Rusty, a dark-bearded man of uncertain age and enormous girth. Drew imagined that Rusty owned a loud motorcycle and a pit bull. Rusty apologized in advance for his snoring. My last girlfriend said it was like a Bach fugue, he confided with a grin. His face clouded over. I didn't know what the fuck a Bach fugue was, so I beat her again. From the bed next to his issued a sound not unlike what might play outside a haunted house at Halloween. After a breakfast of eggs, toast, and orange juice the next morning, the patients had an hour to themselves. Most of them opted to return to their rooms and sleep, although at least 2 signs posted on the walls of the wards discouraged napping. Drew remained in the day room, anticipating a conversation with the poo woman, but as she reminded him, she was scheduled to have her 6th electroshock today. She returned to her room and emerged wearing a blue hospital gown. Her feet were bare. You would think I was about to give birth or have my appendix removed, she said. My name is Erica, by the way. Drew introduced himself and they shook hands. You have cold hands, she said. You know what they say about cold hands. Cold hands, warm heart, he said. Oh, she said, is that it? I thought it had something to do with vampires. Presently a nurse came for her. When I come back, Erica told Drew, I may not remember we had this conversation, so I hope you don't mind if we have it again. Erica walked beside the nurse toward the double doors to the left of the nurse's station. Before departing the ward, she turned and blew Drew a kiss. Are you Adam? A woman's voice asked. He opened his eyes. I go by Drew, he said. Follow me, Drew, the nurse said, and she led him out of the day room to a small conference room at the back of the ward. Inside was a man whose peach fuzz hair made him look like a cancer patient or the singer of a punk band. His skin was as white as his doctor's coat, and a scar ran diagonally from the far corner of his left eye to the left corner of his lips. He introduced himself as Dr. Remscheid. And please call me Dr. Remscheid, rather than by my first name, which is Sebastian, or any of my nicknames, one of which is Rambo, he said. Will do, Drew said. You forgot to add something. I did, Drew said. Yes, you forgot to add my title and my last name. When Drew said nothing in response, the doctor said, Dr. Remscheid, remember? I haven't forgotten, Drew said, sitting in a chair across from Dr. Remscheid's oversized desk. Dr. Remscheid asked him the same questions Herman had, and Drew answered the same way. After a pause, Dr. Remscheid said, I want to start you today on Propax. It's an excellent antidepressant. Unfortunately, we won't be able to gauge its effectiveness for 6 weeks. And there's one major potential side effect. What's that? Drew asked. Impotence, Dr. Remscheid said. Drew opened his mouth but couldn't find the words to convey his incredulity. At last, he managed. Haven't you read my... But there was a knock on the door. It was the nurse with another patient. Lunch was followed by dead time. As Drew sat slumped in one of the day room's chairs, he saw Erica return, a nurse escorting her. Erica moved slowly, her shoulders sagging. She looked like she was about to collapse. When she saw him, she stopped but gave no sign of recognition. He lifted his hand, a tentative wave. All right, said the nurse, who was as dark as Erica was fair. Enough of the one flew over the cuckoo's nest routine. Erica laughed and stood straight. They're no fun here, she said, winking at Drew. Despite her apparent cheerfulness, she returned to her room to sleep and didn't reappear until after lunch, during art therapy class. She found a spot next to Drew on the floor. How was your treatment? He asked her. Shocking, she said. The art therapist, a short, round-faced woman from India, asked the patients to paint their worst nightmares on one half of the sheet of paper and their happiest dream on the other half. For Drew, the nightmare was easy, a collision of reds, engorged body parts, blood, herpes. The happiest dream was harder to conjure. During his first year in California, he dated a woman named Barbara from Santa Barbara. He teased her about this as if he had been the first person to make this joke. Her gaze was appealingly asymmetrical. Her right eye was larger than her left, and she enjoyed fiddling with words. They would play late-night games of Scrabble, or, as they drank a bottle of wine on her couch, rewrite the lyrics of pop songs so that they'd all mention dandelions or flatulence. He never worked up the courage to tell her how he really made a living, although she must have discovered the truth. She stopped returning his calls. He held his paintbrush over the blank right side of his paper, wondering. How does it feel to be back in kindergarten? Erica whispered to him. I was thinking preschool, Drew said. 5 more minutes, the art therapist said. Drew began painting without intention. He ended up with a dark landscape. The art therapist said she was certain she saw a serene moon emerging from behind black clouds. Erica had painted a picture of the devil sword fighting with the Easter Bunny. "It's always war with me," she said, sighing. In bed that night, Drew wondered if he should try to masturbate, but he imagined there were sores on his penis, sores as prominent as moguls on a black diamond ski slope. Besides, on the rare occasions he tried to pleasure himself, the nude women he summoned from memory and imagination inevitably dissolved, distressingly, into their prepubescent selves. They even spoke to him in age-appropriate voices. One blonde-haired girl, 6 years old maybe, her pubis as hairless as glass, said, "I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up, but I'll probably end up sucking cocks." Another girl, even younger, and with curly black hair and rose-red lips, said, "For me, self-empowerment will mean allowing anonymous men to fuck me 4 ways to Friday so other anonymous men can watch my DVDs and videos and pretend they're fucking me 6 ways to Saturday. I also like ponies and rainbows." In the next morning's re-entry into society group, in which patients were expected to share their fears and hopes about returning to their lives on the outside, no one said anything. "Would anyone like to speculate about why we're so silent today?" asked the group's leader, a social worker named Bradley, whose 6 gold earrings, 3 in each ear, shone like circles of fire against his ebony skin. After a few minutes of silence, a new admit, a woman in her late 40s, who constantly chewed on her lower lip, said, "Were you on the Ohio Eastern basketball team about 5 years ago?" Bradley sighed. "Yes," he admitted. "I knew it," she squealed. "I knew it was you." She turned to her fellow patients, as if hoping to find similar enthusiasm. No one said a word. The silence continued until the same woman turned to Drew and said, "And you look familiar too." Eyes turned to him. He swore he heard a growing murmur of recognition, but the silence returned and prevailed. "Why isn't anyone talking?" Bradley asked. 5 minutes later, he asked the same question. When the session ended, Drew idled in the day room with the rest of the patients until his appointment with Dr. Ramsheed. He made certain to call him Dr. Ramsheed 3 times within the first minute, figuring if he could appease the doctor's need to be addressed formally, he could question him about his treatment plan. But the doctor was more interested in hearing details of Drew's film career. Dr. Ramsheed mentioned the names of porn actors with the casual expertise of a baseball fan reciting the starting lineup of his hometown team. Drew tried, without success, to change the subject. In the afternoon, the patients had an hour of recreation therapy in the first floor gymnasium. They were led in calisthenics by another former Ohio Eastern basketball star, who, given his enormous height, must have played center. During sit-ups, Drew held Erica's feet. "Let me warn you, I'm still in a big-time mania, so take everything I say with a tablet of lithium." Erica huffed as he softly counted the number of her sit-ups. "But I think you're cute. My dick doesn't work," he whispered back. She didn't break her sit-up rhythm. "For how long?" 8 months. "Winters in Siberia are longer. And I have herpes." "So did my grandma," Erica said. "And when she died of a heart attack, she was with a UPS driver who certainly knew how to deliver a package." Erica laughed in a huffing way. "I used to be a porn actor," Drew said. "There are worse ways to make a living," she said. "If I could have $100 for all the loveless sex I've had, well, I'd be right where I am today, only richer." He tried to smile and half succeeded. "I still think you're cute," Erica said. "Have I done 50 yet?" The next morning, Drew was promoted to level orange, which gave him the right, twice a day, to follow one of the nurses into the hallway, down 2 flights of stairs, and into a fenced-in courtyard. At the end of it, in the middle, was a locked gate. It was made of the same black iron as the rest of the fence, except its lock was red. It seemed, Drew thought, like a fairy tale door, like something you'd walk through to enter a new world. On his most recent outing to the cage, as even the nurses referred to the enclosure, Drew wore only a t-shirt and blue jeans, but he could see his breath pour out of his mouth. It was about 9 in the morning, but what month was it? He wondered. When Drew returned to the day room, Erica was sitting cross-legged in front of the TV, which was off. "Good show?" he joked, but she didn't reply. Erica was only at level red, which meant she couldn't go outside. The risk of her escape or her suicide was too great, even under supervision. Level red also meant she couldn't have any visitors. Drew was allowed this privilege, but when Barry called Drew before lunch and asked if he could come see him, Drew said he would prefer to recover in anonymity. "It's just as well," Barry said. "If I showed up, they'd probably want to keep me." After lunch, Erica again sat in front of the blank TV. Her eyes were closed and she was whispering something. Meditation? Drew asked. Erica opened her eyes. No, something more ambitious, she said. I'm trying to communicate with aliens. I'm begging them to take me away from this sad, sad world. A moment later, Drew was called in to see Dr. Ramshid, but Dr. Ramshid had been replaced by Dr. Salvador Hernandez, a man in his 60s with a lean, freckled face, a silver mustache, and a gap-toothed smile. The desk, too, had changed, from gigantic to medium-sized. What happened to Dr. Ramshid? Drew asked. Rambo? Dr. Hernandez said, shaking his head. He's been transferred to food services. Drew couldn't tell if he was joking. With your permission, I'd like to change your meds, said Dr. Hernandez. The idea of throwing Pro-Packs on top of erectile dysfunction is like treating heat rash by sending the patient to a tanning salon. After they had talked for a while, Dr. Hernandez said, I think your herpes is both a real affliction and a form of self-punishment. Self-punishment? Drew asked. Even if you wanted to resume your sex life, and your impotence, I'm convinced, is a problem of desire or lack thereof rather than anything physical. Your herpes, by its near continuous presence, would keep you celibate. It's your superego. It is saying, never again. They talked more, and Dr. Hernandez suggested Drew might write to a few of the women with whom he had intercourse on film and now thought of with regret and guilt. Specifically, he could write to Erin. What would I say? Drew asked him. You could tell her you remember her, Dr. Hernandez said. You could tell her you hope she's all right. That's it? I don't know, Dr. Hernandez said, smiling. Throw in a marriage proposal. See what comes back. Why don't you try acting in regular movies, Erica said. You know, the Hollywood kind. They'd finished their 28th game of Crazy Eights. The day room was empty except for Rusty, who was snoring in front of the football game on TV. It was late. The nurse would soon tell them to go to their bedrooms. I'm not convinced I can act, Drew said. I can, Erica said. Watch. Erica dropped her head down to the table and began to cry. That's good, he said. She lifted her face. Her cheeks were red and damp. Very good, he said. Drew waited for her to stop crying, to wink. When she didn't, he felt a rush of anxiety, and he turned to look for the nurse. But instead of going to find her, he put his hand on Erica's shoulder. Still crying, she leaned her head against it. You get the part, he said. She didn't smile, but she stopped crying. In his next meeting with Dr. Hernandez, Drew talked about all the women he'd been involved with romantically, and how he'd given up dating anyone but the women he worked with. Why? Dr. Hernandez asked. I was lazy, I guess, Drew said. I knew them already. Did you? Did you really know them? I thought I did. Or maybe I told myself I did, so I didn't have to know them. For Drew, evenings now had the feeling of a slumber party in which he left the boys in order to sit with the host's sister in the den and play cards and talk. If there was anything good about the Mad, it was this, even when, as now, Erica stared up at him from her cards with a look so drained of emotion, so stripped of life. He doubted he could reach her, even with the most outrageous declaration. He wanted to say something to her, though something kind, but every phrase he conceived seemed as stilted and unimaginative as a line from one of his movies. So they played cards without saying anything at all. In their next meeting, Dr. Hernandez said, Are you aware that the Eastern Ohio University Hospital has one of the most well-respected sex addiction clinics in the country? Are you suggesting I'm a sex addict? Drew asked incredulously. Not at all, said Dr. Hernandez. But after your discharge, you'll walk past the sex addiction waiting room. There's a chance you'll be recognized. It won't be the first time, Drew said, smiling. Dr. Hernandez touched his silver mustache. I think you're ready to go home. But the antidepressants haven't had a chance to kick in, Drew said. We'll have a thorough outpatient treatment plan in place for you. But you've done much of the important work already. And you're telling the truth when you say you don't feel like jumping off the Main Street Bridge now, correct? I don't think I'd even stop to look over the side. I've only seen one porn film in my life, Erica told Drew. It was night and they were playing their fourth game of Chutes and Ladders. Erica had won the first 3, and when Drew said she must be cheating, she said, No, it's because I've had hours of practice. Every stay-at-home mom learns to become a Chutes and Ladders all-star. Drew had asked her about her children and husband once, but she told him she didn't like to talk about them. It made her too sad, she said. So he hadn't asked again. My brother and a friend of his found or rented or stole a porn video, Erica said. They were watching it late at night in the basement of our house. My parents were sleeping, or maybe they were out of town. My brother might have been old enough to look after us both. But when I walked in on them, they pretended they didn't notice me. Rusty, sitting on the couch, was snoring. The noises he produced at once comical and funereal. In the lone window, the lights of the hospital parking lot looked like fluorescent heads on thin black stakes. Were they watching hardcore? Drew asked. He didn't think he would have been old enough to have appeared in the movie, although he braced himself to discover he had. Hard enough, Erica said. Although, to the movie's credit, there was a plot, which had to do with a knight, a princess, and a sex-crazed stepmother of a queen. Drew relaxed. He hadn't even heard of it, although he could guess its title, A Knight in Shining Ardor. No, he thought, too soft, too sweet. They didn't try very hard with the setting, Erica continued. It was supposed to be a medieval castle, but I could see a washer and dryer in one scene. I guess we weren't supposed to notice much besides the screwing, which I did find interesting, at first. But not even halfway through the film, I saw how mechanical it all was. It reminded me of a cuckoo bird and a cuckoo clock. In and out, with plenty of nonsense cuckoo noise. She paused. I'm sure your movies were better. I never watched them, Drew said. This had been true, anyway, for the past couple of years. I guess I'm a romantic when it comes to movies, Erica said. I want there to be courtship, kisses, poetry even, before the clothes come off. Drew glanced out the window and saw the stadium's lights had been turned on. There could be no game at this hour, so the stadium crew was probably testing the lights. But Drew preferred to think the lights had come on by themselves, fulfilling a spontaneous desire to shine. He turned to share the scene with Erica, but she buried her head in the crook of her right arm and was softly sobbing. A nurse announced it was 10 o'clock and time for bed. In their last meeting, Dr. Hernandez told Drew, there's one more piece of advice you need to accept. All right, Drew said. It comes in 3 parts. Drew nodded. First, forgive yourself. Second, forgive yourself. And third, forgive myself, Drew cut in. Third, said Dr. Hernandez, look at your case of herpes as an occasional annoyance, a permanent but manageable affliction acquired in a job and a life you've outgrown. Do not see it as a sign from God or fate of your complicity in the continued suffering of human beings, unclothed women in particular. Meanwhile, look at your impotence as temporary, a holding pattern you put yourself in as you establish a new balance in your life between sex and love and trust. And also, he added, forgive yourself. At midnight, Drew was awoken by a soft whisper. Let's get out of here for a while. It was Erica, her face moon bright in the dark of the room. In the bed next to Drew's, Rusty's snores sounded like a clarinet concerto, played in a garbage can. Erica, who was wearing blue jeans and a brown t-shirt, watched him dress. In his old life, he would have felt at ease with this. He wouldn't even have noticed her presence. But as he stood in his underwear and short-sleeved, button-down blue shirt with yellow pinstripes, he felt self-conscious. He caught her eyes, and she smiled before turning her head. He finished dressing. Where are we going? He whispered. To breathe, Erica said. The nurse's station was empty, but to the left of the station, sitting slumped against a wall, was Herman. He appeared to be talking to himself. We'll get caught, Drew said resignatedly. But Erica kept walking. From up close, Herman looked like a koala bear in the wake of a eucalyptus binge. He lifted his right hand and formed a peace sign. What's wrong with him? Drew whispered. Ecstasy, Erica replied. Not the drug, but the state of mind. A few more feet down the hallway, they reached the locked door. Here's where the adventure ends, Drew thought. But Erica produced a ring full of keys. Did you seal them off, Herman? Drew asked. He knew he probably shouldn't be so interested in the nuts and bolts of their breakout. He might be called on to testify to his part in it. Herman and I agreed on an exchange, Erica said. Before Drew could inquire, she added, desperate times call for blowjobs. Drew thought he'd heard the line before. The postman always comes twice. As Erica pushed the keys into the lock, he caught a glimpse of the keychain. It was a miniature of Freud smoking a cigar. Erica saw him looking at it. This is what passes for humor around here, she said. Now show me a keychain of Freud with a cigar up his ass and smoke blowing out his ears. Then I'm laughing. Drew wondered what would happen to him if they were caught. Would he still be allowed to return home tomorrow, or would this return be postponed indefinitely and his unit status reduced to level red? They walked down 2 flights of steps, pushed open another door, and found themselves in the cage. Drew thought their journey was finished, but Erica marched to the iron door at the far end. After several keys didn't fit the red lock, she held up a gold key. It looked as ancient as a key to a treasure chest. She inserted it and the door sprung open. A few hundred yards in front of them, the football stadium looked like a diaphragm for a giantess. Wow, Erica said, breathing in the cool air. We could do anything now. We could even kill ourselves. She turned to him. Do you want to? Walking at even a leisurely pace, they could be at the Main Street Bridge in an hour. Or they could climb onto the stadium's roof or to one of its high corners, with their easy-to-scale guardrails and jump. But death held only a faint appeal to Drew now. I didn't think you did, Erica said. Too bad. I guess we'll have to go to the 50-yard line and fuck like high school kids on prom night. Drew sighed. He was about to speak when Erica said, "Herpes isn't an obstacle." From her pocket, she removed a batch of condoms in silver, red, and baby blue packages. A couple of them trickled out of her palm and fell to the asphalt. She didn't bother to pick them up. They headed across the empty hospital parking lot toward the stadium. The parking lot's lights were enormous, white-yellow balls. "You're married," Drew said, "and my husband is a beautiful, kind man," Erica said sincerely. "He's the vice principal of an elementary school over in Sheridan. We have 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl. They're 99% perfect, which is about 49% more than a parent has a right to expect. All 3 of them write me every day. I used to have visiting privileges, but the last time my husband came to see me, I tried to hang myself with his belt." "You're luckier than I am," she continued. "At least you have something to pin your condition on. You have the whole porn career, your venereal disease, and your abusive father." "How do you know about my father?" Drew asked, not with anger, but out of startled curiosity. "I guessed. Find me a white coat and I'll be part of your treatment team." They left the parking lot and stood at the locked gates of the stadium. Again, Erica produced her ring of keys. On her first try, she opened the gate. "I don't understand," Drew said. "You mean why Herman would have keys to the football stadium? He's 65 years old. He's held every job in this town twice. I think he was even mayor once, back in the mid-70s. There was something awe-inspiring, Drew thought, about football stadiums, latter-day coliseums. The near goal post, shrouded in mist, looked like a redesigned crucifix. And Drew swore he could hear echoes of voices swirling around the concrete stands and aluminum seats. Drew felt Erica's hand on his. "Don't worry," she said. "We won't do anything you don't want to do. I know you're concerned about my marital status. I'm sure that plenty of ladies you worked with were married and you probably didn't care. But I respect that you're in a new stage of your life." They stopped at the 50-yard line and Erica let go of his hand. He immediately missed her touch. She began to undress, lining up her jeans, t-shirt, and shoes on the grass as if outfitting a reclining mannequin. He hesitated before doing the same with his clothes. "That's right," she said. "Let it go." She unsnapped her bra, releasing breasts larger and less firm than he would have thought. She covered both of her nipples with her index fingers. "A year and 2 months," she said. "I nursed my oldest, the boy, for a year and 2 months. But my daughter I barely nursed at all. After she was born, I had postpartum depression so bad it was like the devil shoved his pitchfork in my head. I haven't been the same since." She lowered her underwear to her knees. "I had the perfect life, and what did I do with it? I huffed and I puffed and I blew myself right out of it." "It's waiting for you," Drew said. "It won't be the same." "It doesn't have to be. What's there is more than enough." "All right, doctor." He wanted to say more, to jolt her in a way her electroshock treatment couldn't. He wanted her to be happy, wanted to make her happy. When had he last felt this impulse? "You're still wearing your underwear," Erica said. "Right," he said. He lowered it solemnly. His penis was flaccid, but in the darkness his herpes sores, if he had them, were disguised. If the night was cold, he didn't feel it. Erica took his hand again. "Onto our beach blankets," she said, gesturing to their clothes, and they lowered themselves onto them. Above them, blue-gray clouds dominated the black sky. Here and there, like cat's eyes peering from a closet, were stars. "I've always thought the Big Bang really was a Big Bang," Erica says. "What do you mean?" Erica laughed softly. "God's beautiful orgasm." They were still holding hands. "I think I'm getting better," he ventured. "I know you are," she said. "You're leaving tomorrow. Were you going to tell me or just leave me heartbroken?" "I have mixed feelings about it," he said. "It's normal to feel ambivalent about leaving a secure place. Even prisoners are ambivalent about going home when their sentences are up," she said. "But I wish you had told me." "I'm sorry." "You're forgiven." She squeezed his hand and sighed. "I wish I was getting better. But the chemistry experiment in my head went wrong, and all these drugs and electroshock treatments are doing is confirming my hopelessness. I'm incurable." "I thought I was too," Drew said. He breathed in. The air was moist and fragrant. The grass smelled like flowers, or perhaps the smell was Erica. He breathed out. "But the problems I told you about are still problems," he said. "I think you need a new fantasy," she told him. He waited for her to explain. "After you hit puberty, I bet you became fixated on the standard heterosexual male fantasy. Probably involving 2 or more women, right?" "That was fantasy number 1, Drew admitted. "But you've actually lived out fantasy number 1 as well as fantasies 2 and 3 and 300, she said, "and turning these fantasies into reality depended on the participation of certain kinds of women, most of them with histories you wouldn't wish on even a girl who'd broken your heart 100 times. So now your fantasies make you sick." True, Drew conceded. Anyway, Erica said, it's time for you to fantasize outside the box. She giggled. I meant that metaphorically, but I guess it applies literally as well. Alright, what should I fantasize about? Anything besides a menage a trois, or an orgy, or anal sex, she said. Anything besides legs glistening with baby oil and boobs as big as volleyballs. Anything besides women, or men for that matter. Fantasize about the sky, the clouds, the moon. You're kidding. There's nothing sexier than a moonlit night. I've had some of my best orgasms looking up at the stars, thinking about nothing but how gorgeous they are. She paused. Look, you can see a little edge of the moon, like her pale foot. The cloud is keeping her mostly covered. Yeah, he said, I see it. Isn't Mistress Moon lovely tonight? Isn't she just the prettiest thing you've ever seen? She squeezed his hand. He felt his heart pump, felt blood dance to the other parts of his body. And now she's shedding more of her cloud clothing. She's letting you see more of her. She's letting you know her. Sure, Drew said, and feeling something return to him below his waist, he added. She's beautiful. She's beautiful, and she's lonely. She isn't lonely now, Erica says. She isn't lonely now, Erica said. She has you. He couldn't say it was only or even mostly the moon and the star-speckled sky that made him feel what he was feeling. He felt Erica's blood throb against his palms. He felt how warm her hand was. He'd never known how sensual a woman's hand could be. She's beautiful, isn't she? She's splendid and all the darkness. Yes, beautiful, said Drew, thinking of the moon, thinking of Erica. Beautiful. Now the moon was fully revealed, clouds dispatched to the sides of her. The stars burned bright. He held Erica's hand as if he was about to fall. At the same time, he held himself, and he found himself grown. Her hand, the moon. He felt a rush of pleasure, more, of joy. Yes, he said, the words springing from somewhere primitive and essential within him. Yes, she echoed, her hand warming his, the moon burning in the black sky. Yes, again, yes. And his body surged with sensation. As it rushed toward orgasm, he wondered if Erica was pleasing herself. He wanted to be part of her happiness, however small it was, however fleeting. He opened his mouth to speak to her, but his pleasure, as intense as he had ever felt, silenced him. In the delirious waves of his orgasm, he didn't feel her hand disengage from his. A moment later, he heard feet strike across the grass. He looked up to see Erica racing toward the stands, and he was certain, the stadium's dark heights. He pictured her on one of the stadium's perilous edges, pictured her leaping into forever. Erica! He sprang to his feet and chased after her bare ass brilliant and moonlight. He stumbled against a deflated ball or abandoned cleat, and for a second, he thought he was going to fall. He knew falling would mean losing her. But he righted himself and continued running. She bounded up a set of wooden stairs from the field to the stands and climbed toward the right corner. Between the stands and the roof there wasn't even a guardrail, but only sky and a fall of at least 5 stories onto concrete. She was 24 stairs ahead of him, and he feared she would beat him to the edge, but he continued to chase her, and soon he halved the distance between them. She was 2 steps from the unguarded corner when he caught her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his head pressed into her corkscrew curls. She resisted, slashing her elbows into his arms and the sides of his face, her strength surprising and scaring him. He thought she might break his hold, slip from his tiring arms, but at last she relaxed. They were both hot and damp. From their breathing and nakedness, they might have just made the most intense love of their lives. Let me go, Drew, she said. I will, he answered, knowing there might be mercy in doing so. But he didn't let her go. One of the things I really appreciate about this piece is the way the author develops the characters. We get a profound sense of intimacy as these characters develop over the course of the story, and it reads almost like a coming-of-age story, although the characters are well outside the range we expect for a coming-of-age story. They're significantly older, but it's something about the traumas that they've experienced that creates this delay in growth that they now have to do. And I think the title is really interesting in this particular piece. Incurables suggests a kind of lost cause, and 2 characters declare themselves incurable, but are they really? Because we do see a change in perspective. So this story deals a lot with shame, with sex, with feelings of self-worth, and these characters do grow and change in their perspective. So maybe in some aspects they are not necessarily uncurable. They are worthy of love, they are worthy of redemption, and we do connect to them. What did you find most interesting about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. Thank you to the writers who participated in this series this year. I'm grateful for your time, your friendship, and your work. Thank you to the Appalachian artist Logan Venderlich for creating original music for the series to help me set a tone. Thank you to everyone who likes, shares, subscribes, comments, and of course, everybody who watches. Until next month, see you, love you, bye.